The first time Lena noticed the door, it wasn't there. Not really. It was a whisper of an outline, a faint seam in the brick wall of her apartment stairwell. She passed it on her way up from doing laundry, her basket heavy and her patience thin, and thought nothing of it. Just a trick of the dim light, the kind of shadow a tired brain creates. She climbed the stairs and forgot. The second time, it couldn't be ignored. She was carrying groceries that evening, the bags cutting into her hands, when she froze mid-step. There it was again. The seam had grown bolder, the edges clearer. Now there was a knob, brass and polished to a strange shine, though the wall still looked solid as stone. The air near it felt different, cooler, like standing next to an open refrigerator. She leaned closer, narrowing her eyes, and swore she heard something faint, just beneath the hum of the hallway light. Not a voice, exactly. More like the suggestion of one. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, snapping her out of it. She glanced at the door one last time, shook her head, and trudged back upstairs. The groceries could wait. She didn't want to think about it. By the third time, thinking was unavoidable. Lena stood in front of it now, her hands stuffed into her hoodie pockets, her breath shallow. The door was complete. No more tricks of light, no imaginary seams. It stood proud and deliberate, its wood dark and smooth, its frame edged with carvings so intricate they seemed to shimmer in the fluorescent glare of the hallway. This wasn't normal. She knew that. She should have called someone. Her landlord, a neighbor, anyone who might have a better explanation than weird stuff happens sometimes. But deep down, Lena knew no one else would see what she saw. This door wasn't here for anyone else. She reached out, her hand trembling as it brushed the cool brass of the knob. The carvings on the frame seemed to ripple in her peripheral vision, but when she turned her head, they were still again, as though they'd never moved. Her fingers tightened. She turned the knob. The air changed instantly. It rushed past her as the door swung inward, a gust heavy with the smell of rain and stone, though it hadn't rained in weeks. Beyond the threshold was a staircase, spiraling downward into darkness. The walls were lined with flickering torches, their light casting strange shadows that danced like restless fingers. The doorframe hummed faintly under her touch, a sensation that buzzed in her bones. Okay, she whispered to herself, this is where normal people turn around. But she didn't. She stepped through. The air inside was heavier, thick with moisture and something else, an unnameable tension that pressed against her chest. The door closed behind her with a soft click, and when she turned, the wall was blank. No way out. Her footsteps echoed as she descended, the sound sharp and lonely. Each step felt deliberate, as though the staircase were guiding her rather than the other way around. The torches grew dimmer the farther she went, until the darkness ahead became a solid thing, swallowing the light completely. And then the staircase ended. She stood on a smooth stone floor, her breath clouding in the air, though she wasn't cold. The space around her stretched impossibly wide, the kind of vastness that made her feel like a single speck in an ocean of nothing. At the center of the room was a table. On it sat a small, ornate box. The box was silver, its surface etched with the same intricate patterns as the doorframe. Its lid was slightly ajar, revealing a faint, pulsing light that seemed to breathe with its own rhythm. Lena approached slowly, her heartbeat matching the pulse of the glow. She reached for the lid. "Do you know what you're doing?" The voice was deep, resonant, and utterly calm. Lena froze, her hand hovering inches from the box. She turned, but the room was empty. The shadows along the walls stretched unnaturally, as though trying to lean closer. "Who's there?" she asked, her voice unsteady. "Do you know what you're doing?" the voice repeated. This time, it was closer, though she still saw no one. "No," she admitted, because lying felt pointless. The light from the box flared, casting the room in a sharp, cold glow. The shadows recoiled, shrinking into the corners. For the first time, Lena noticed the floor wasn't smooth. Symbols were carved into the stone, radiating outward from the table in strange, interlocking patterns. "This isn't for you," the voice said. It was louder now, insistent, though it didn't sound angry. "But you've come anyway." The lid of the box shifted, as though moved by an invisible hand. The light inside grew stronger, brighter, and Lena felt an overwhelming urge to look closer. Her fingers brushed the edge of the lid. "Wait!" the voice snapped, sharp enough to make her flinch. She stepped back, her heart pounding. "What is this? Why am I here?" The shadows shifted, twisting into a shape. A tall, indistinct figure, its edges blurred like smoke caught in a breeze. It didn't have a face, but she felt it watching her. "You shouldn't have come," it said. "But now you must decide." "Decide what?" The figure gestured toward the box. "To open it, or to leave it closed." "What happens if I open it?" The figure paused, its smoky form flickering faintly. "Everything changes." "And if I don't?" "Everything stays the same." Lena stared at the box, its pulsing light filling her vision. She thought about the life waiting for her upstairs, the empty apartment, the unanswered messages, the days that blurred into weeks without meaning. Everything the same. Her hand moved before she could stop it, lifting the lid. The light spilled out, warm and alive, flooding the room in a wave that swept over her. For a moment, she felt weightless, her mind filling with images she couldn't comprehend. Fractured glimpses of places and people that weren't hers, a kaleidoscope of colors and sounds that blurred into something vast and uncontainable. And then, silence. The box was empty. The room was gone. She stood in the hallway of her apartment building, the faint hum of the overhead light the only sound. The door was gone. The wall was seamless brick once more. But the weight of the box lingered in her hands, even though she wasn't holding it anymore. The envelope was waiting for me on the kitchen table when I came home. I didn't put it there. I lived alone, and I'd locked the door before leaving that morning, the same way I always did. Yet there it was, an unassuming white envelope with my name written across the front in a neat, mechanical hand. The first thing I noticed was the texture of the paper. It was too smooth, almost waxy, like it hadn't been made for ordinary use. The ink seemed to shimmer faintly, though the kitchen light was dim. I opened it without much thought, expecting a misplaced bill or some spam. Inside was a single card, thick and glossy, bearing a short message in the same neat handwriting. "Tomorrow at 11:13 a.m., room 313. Don't be late." There was no sender, no logo, no explanation. I flipped the card over, searching for some kind of clue, but the back was blank. My first instinct was to laugh it off. A prank, maybe, or a marketing gimmick for some escape room or immersive theater experience. But the handwriting bothered me. It wasn't just neat. It was too neat, too precise, almost printed but not quite. The letters were perfectly even, as though they'd been designed by a machine but written by a hand that didn't know how to be human. I set the card aside, telling myself I'd forget about it by morning, but I didn't. That night, I dreamed of a hallway. It was narrow and cold, with walls the color of old bone. The floor was polished, reflecting the faint glow of dim overhead lights, and the air was damp, thick with the smell of metal. At the end of the hallway was a door with the number 313 etched into its surface. The door was slightly ajar. A soft light spilled out, flickering like a candle, and as I moved closer, I heard something. A low, rhythmic tapping, like fingers drumming on a wooden surface. When I reached for the handle, the tapping stopped. I woke with my hand outstretched, clutching at empty air. The next morning, I told myself it was just a coincidence. A strange card, a stranger dream, nothing more. But as the clock neared 11:13, an uneasy pull began to build in my chest, an irrational urge to find out if the message on the card meant something. I don't know why I gave in. I found myself at an unfamiliar building, the kind you wouldn't notice unless you were looking for it. It was old, red brick, with tall, narrow windows that gleamed darkly in the sunlight. The kind of place that looked forgotten, yet perfectly preserved. The lobby was empty. The air felt heavy, and the walls seemed to absorb sound. Even my footsteps didn't echo as I crossed the polished floor to the directory on the wall. There it was, room 313, third floor. I climbed the stairs, my pulse quickening with each step. The hallway on the third floor was identical to the one in my dream. Same bone-colored walls, same polished floor, same dim overhead lights. And at the end of the hall, the door marked 313. It was ajar, just like before. A faint light flickered inside, casting long, wavering shadows across the floor. I stood there for a moment, my heart pounding, debating whether to walk away. But before I could decide, the door creaked open a little wider, as if inviting me in. Inside, the room was empty. The walls were bare, the floor spotless, and the light came from a single bulb that swung gently from the ceiling. In the center of the room was a chair. On the chair sat another envelope. This one was black, its surface velvety to the touch. My name was written on it again, but this time the letters were embossed, raised like braille. I opened it with trembling fingers, pulling out a folded piece of paper. "Sit down." I looked at the chair, my pulse hammering in my ears. It wasn't remarkable, just a simple wooden chair with a worn seat and scuffed legs. But something about it felt wrong, like it had been waiting for me longer than I'd been alive. I almost left, but the pull, the same irrational pull that had brought me here, kept me rooted to the spot. I sat. The light above me flickered and dimmed. For a moment, nothing happened, just silence, so profound it felt physical. Then the door swung shut, and the room plunged into total darkness. "Do you remember?" a voice asked. It was soft, almost kind, but it wasn't coming from anywhere in particular. It seemed to echo inside my own head, the words weaving into my thoughts like they'd always been there. "I don't understand," I said, my voice cracking. The chair beneath me felt warmer, almost alive, and the air grew heavy with the smell of damp earth and ash. "You left," the voice said. "You left, and you forgot." "Forgot what?" I whispered. The light flickered back on, but the room was no longer empty. The walls were covered in pictures, hundreds of them, pinned haphazardly across every surface. Pictures of me. Some were old, photos I didn't even recognize of myself as a child, a teenager, a younger adult. Others were recent, so recent they showed me in places I'd been earlier that week. In every photo, I was alone. The chair beneath me creaked, and I stood up, backing toward the door. But the door was gone. The walls began to shift, the pictures peeling off and fluttering to the ground, replaced by something darker, deeper. A void stretched out where the walls had been, and in that void, shapes began to emerge, vague, human-like, but wrong. "You left us," the voice said, louder now, layered and fractured. "You were supposed to stay." The shapes moved closer, their forms twisting as though the void itself resisted them. My chest tightened, my breath shallow and quick. "I don't know what you want," I said, my voice trembling. "You do." The chair splintered behind me, the sound sharp and sudden, and the void consumed the last of the light. When I opened my eyes, I was back in my kitchen. The white envelope was on the table again. This time, the card inside had a different message. "Tomorrow at 11:13 a.m., room 313. Don't be late." I tried to throw it away, to forget, to tell myself it wasn't real. But I know the truth. Tomorrow, I'll go back. I have no choice. I never did. The road to Westfield wasn't on any map I'd seen. It was a narrow, unpaved stretch of dirt that wound its way through dense woods, the kind of road you'd miss unless you were looking for it. But I hadn't been looking. I'd been driving home from a friend's cabin, trying to beat the storm brewing in the sky above. My phone's GPS had stopped working hours ago, leaving me reliant on old-fashioned instincts and increasingly unreliable road signs. When I saw the turnoff, I figured it might shave some time off the drive. It didn't. The trees pressed closer as I drove, their branches arching overhead like a canopy, blocking out what little light remained. The air grew colder, and the storm clouds darkened, though the rain hadn't started yet. I told myself it was just a shortcut, a back road through the woods that would spit me out somewhere familiar. But after 30 minutes of winding turns and no sign of another car, my confidence faltered. The first sign of Westfield was the gas station. I almost didn't see it at first, hidden behind a row of pine trees. The building was small, squat, its single pump rusted and leaning slightly to one side. A flickering neon sign above the door spelled out gas in faint, buzzing letters. I was running low, so I pulled in, the gravel crunching under my tires as I parked next to the pump. Inside, The station was dimly lit and cramped, its shelves lined with dusty cans and candy bars that looked older than I was. The man behind the counter was pale and thin, his face gaunt and angular, as though someone had stretched his skin too tightly over his skull. He didn't speak when I walked in, just nodded once and watched me as I browsed. "Do you know how far it is to the highway?" I asked, my voice too loud in the quiet space. He blinked slowly, his eyes a pale, watery blue. "Which way you headin'?" "East." He tilted his head, considering. "Not much out east. Just Westfield." "Westfield?" I frowned. "I've never heard of it." "Most folks haven't," he said, his lips curling into a faint smile. The way he said it made my stomach twist, though I couldn't explain why. I nodded awkwardly, paid for my gas, and left without looking back. The road narrowed further as I drove on, the trees growing denser until they seemed to scrape against the sides of the car. Just as I began to consider turning around, the woods opened up and I saw the town. Westfield wasn't what I expected. It wasn't much of anything, really. A handful of buildings lined a single street, their wooden facades weathered and leaning. There was a diner, a general store, and a post office, though none of them looked open. A few cars were parked along the road, but they were old, decades old, covered in rust and layers of grime, as though they hadn't been moved in years. I should have kept driving. I told myself that later, over and over. But something about the town drew me in. Maybe it was the way the clouds seemed to part as I approached, the soft light spilling over the rooftops. Or maybe it was the faint sound of music drifting through the air, barely audible but unmistakably there. A piano, playing a slow, haunting tune. I parked in front of the diner and stepped out, the air cool and heavy with the scent of rain. The music grew louder as I approached, and when I pushed open the door, a bell jingled softly above my head. The diner was almost empty. A few people sat at scattered tables, their heads bowed over steaming cups of coffee. A waitress stood behind the counter, her hair pinned up in a style decades out of date, the folds of her uniform crisp and immaculate. She smiled when she saw me, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Have a seat," she said, gesturing to a booth near the window. I hesitated but sat down, my eyes scanning the room. The other patrons didn't look up. They didn't speak. They just sat there, perfectly still, as though frozen in time. The waitress brought me a cup of coffee without asking, setting it down with a practiced ease. "Passing through?" she asked. "Yeah," I said, forcing a smile. "Just trying to get back to the highway." Her smile widened, but it felt off. Too broad, too knowing. Not many people find their way to Westfield. "Is there a quicker route?" I asked, hoping to steer the conversation back to something useful. She tilted her head, her eyes flicking toward the window. "Depends on where you're headed." "East," I said, "toward the city." Her expression flickered, just for a moment, something unreadable passing over her face. "The city's a long way off," she said. "Might be best to stay the night." I shook my head. "I really need to keep moving." Her smile returned, but it didn't feel like an answer. She stepped back behind the counter, and I noticed something strange. The music was gone. The piano, which had been so clear moments ago, had vanished as though it had never been there. I didn't finish the coffee. When I left the diner, the light had changed. The clouds were lower now, pressing against the tops of the trees, and the air felt heavier, harder to breathe. The street was empty. The cars that had been parked along the road were gone, though I hadn't heard them leave. I got into my car and started the engine, the sound breaking the oppressive silence. The road out of town stretched ahead of me, the trees closing in like a tunnel. I didn't look back as I drove, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. But the road didn't take me back to the highway. No matter how far I drove, no matter how many turns I took, I kept ending up back in Westfield. The gas station, the diner, the general store. They were always there, waiting, like the pieces of a puzzle I couldn't solve. The sun never fully set in Westfield. The light just dimmed, hanging in the air like the last glow of twilight, never giving way to night. I don't know how long I stayed there, hours, days, maybe longer. Time felt different, stretched and frayed, as though it didn't matter. Eventually, I stopped driving. The roads didn't lead anywhere, and the gas gauge on my car never seemed to drop. I walked the streets instead, trying to find someone who would explain, who would tell me what I needed to do to leave. The people of Westfield don't talk much. They smile, they nod, but their eyes are empty, like windows to an abandoned house. The waitress still serves coffee in the diner, and the man at the gas station still leans against the counter, his watery blue eyes following me when I enter. And every now and then, I hear the piano again, playing that same slow, haunting tune. I've stopped trying to find it. I don't know what Westfield is or why I can't leave, but I know this. The road that brought me here wasn't on any map, and I don't think it ever was. The train station had been abandoned for decades, but every night at 2:17 a.m., the train arrived. The first time I saw it, I was walking home from my shift at the diner. My car was in the shop, and the shortcut through the old station saved me 20 minutes. The place had always given me the creeps: boarded-up ticket booths, broken windows, and a platform choked with weeds. But that night, something was different. I heard the whistle before I saw the light. It was faint at first, almost drowned out by the wind. Then it grew louder, a piercing, mournful wail that cut through the night. A beam of light swept across the platform, illuminating the rusted tracks, and the air filled with the metallic screech of wheels grinding against steel. The train pulled in slowly, its brakes hissing like a living thing. It was beautiful, an old-fashioned steam locomotive, its black body gleaming as though it had been polished that very day. The windows were dark, and the carriages were pristine, untouched by time or graffiti. For a moment, I stood frozen, unsure if I was hallucinating. The station hadn't been operational since before I was born, and the tracks didn't even connect to the main line anymore. And yet, here it was. The doors slid open with a hiss. No one stepped out. No conductor appeared. The platform remained eerily empty. I don't know why I did it, but I stepped closer. Inside the train, the lights flickered, casting strange, shifting shadows across the velvet seats. A faint hum emanated from within, a sound that seemed to vibrate through my bones. I leaned forward, peering into the nearest carriage, and caught a glimpse of something moving. A flicker of motion in the farthest seat, too quick to make out. A chill crept up my spine. I turned to leave, but then I heard it. A voice, faint and muffled, calling my name. Anna. It came from inside the train. I froze. No one knew I was here. The voice called again, louder this time. Anna, come here. It was a voice I recognized. My mother's. She'd been dead for 10 years. The rational part of me screamed to leave, to run as far away from the station as possible. But my legs wouldn't move. The voice was so familiar, so warm, like a hand reaching out from a memory. Before I knew it, I was stepping onto the train. The air inside was cold, colder than it should have been for a summer night. The velvet seats were immaculate, their rich burgundy color shining under the flickering lights. The windows reflected my pale face, but beyond them, the night outside seemed impossibly dark, as though the train had left the station and plunged into a void. I moved down the aisle, my footsteps muffled by the plush carpet. Anna, the voice called again, coming from farther down the carriage. My mother's voice. The train felt endless, the carriages stretching on and on as I walked. Each one was the same. Empty seats, flickering lights, that faint hum in the air. The only difference was the smell. It started faint, like burnt wood, but as I moved deeper into the train, it grew stronger, acrid and cloying. The voice came again, softer now, almost pleading. Anna, please. When I reached the last carriage, I stopped. The door was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness spilling through the crack. My hand trembled as I pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick, suffocating. The lights didn't flicker here. They burned bright, casting harsh shadows across the walls. And in the center of the carriage sat a figure. At first, I thought it was her, my mother. The shape of her shoulders, the way her hands rested in her lap, it was all so familiar. But when she turned, I knew it wasn't her. Her face was wrong. The features were there, but they were stretched, distorted, as though someone had taken my mother's face and pulled it over something else. Her eyes were too large, too dark, and they didn't blink. Her mouth curved into a smile that was too wide, too sharp. "Anna," she said, her voice dripping with warmth that didn't match her face. "I've been waiting for you." I stumbled back, my heart pounding. The figure stood, unfolding itself with a fluid, unnatural grace. Its limbs seemed too long, bending at odd angles as it moved toward me. "You don't want to leave, do you?" it asked, tilting its head. I couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. Behind it, the walls of the carriage began to shift. The rich velvet seats peeled away, revealing something pulsing and wet beneath. The windows darkened further, black shapes pressing against the glass from the outside, their outlines writhing like worms. The figure took another step toward me, its smile widening. I turned and ran. The train seemed endless now, the carriages stretching on forever as I sprinted back the way I came. The air grew thicker. The smell of burning would replaced by something worse, something metallic and sickly sweet. The lights overhead flickered faster, casting the carriages in a strobe of light and shadow. And behind me, I could hear it. Footsteps. Not running, just walking, slow and deliberate, keeping pace no matter how fast I ran. When I finally reached the first carriage, the door was still open. I threw myself onto the platform, landing hard on the cracked concrete. The train's whistle screamed, and the doors slid shut. I turned to look, expecting to see it standing in the window, but the train was empty again. And then it pulled away, disappearing into the night as if it had never been there. I haven't gone back to the station since, but every night at 2:17 a.m., I hear the whistle. And sometimes, in the quiet moments before I fall asleep, I hear her voice again. "Anna, come back?" When I found the typewriter, it was buried beneath a pile of junk in the corner of the second-hand shop. The place smelled like mildew and old wood, and I'd wandered in more out of boredom than intent. My fingers brushed its keys by accident as I moved a stack of yellowed magazines, and the tactile clack made me pause. Beneath the dust and grime, the typewriter gleamed faintly, its steel frame strangely pristine. I didn't know why I wanted it. I wasn't a writer. I hadn't touched a typewriter in my life. But something about it felt significant, like an artifact unearthed from another time. The owner of the shop, a balding man with a voice like sandpaper, seemed almost relieved when I brought it to the counter. $30, he said. His eyes didn't meet mine. No returns. I nodded, handing over the cash. I didn't ask why he was so eager to be rid of it. When I got it home, I set the typewriter on the old desk in my living room. Up close, it was beautiful. Its keys arranged in perfect symmetry, the letters etched into them sharper than they had any right to be. The brand name on the front was unfamiliar, Octor Noctis. I ran my fingers over the nameplate, the Latin words stirring some half-remembered fragment from high school. Something about the author of the night. I cleaned it up that evening, wiping away the dust and testing the mechanism. The keys moved smoothly, almost eagerly, though the ribbon was dry and useless. Still, when I pressed the keys, they left faint indentations on the paper I'd threaded through. A name formed under my fingers before I even realized what I was typing. Elias. I didn't know an Elias. The name had come unbidden, a strange reflex I couldn't explain. The moment the word was complete, the room felt heavier, like the air had thickened. I brushed it off, telling myself it was my imagination, and went to bed. The first letter arrived the next morning. It was lying on the desk, folded neatly on the typewriter's tray. The paper was the same I'd loaded the night before, but the words weren't mine. The letter was addressed to me by name, written in clipped, formal prose. Dear Mr. Green, thank you for acquiring the Octor Noctis. Your efforts will not go unnoticed. Please proceed with care. Sincerely, Elias. I laughed nervously, turning the paper over in my hands. There was no return address, no sign of tampering. The handwriting, or typing, was unmistakably from the typewriter, but I'd locked the front door. I lived alone. No one could have left it there. I didn't touch the typewriter for 2 days after that, but it called to me, sitting there on the desk, its keys gleaming faintly in the lamplight. On the third night, curiosity won out. I loaded another sheet of paper and began typing, this time without thought, letting my fingers move as they pleased. Words spilled onto the page, forming sentences I didn't understand. When I finished, I had a single, coherent paragraph. The boy sat beneath the tree, the stars heavy above him, his hands stained with blood he could not explain. The wind whispered his name, Elias. I stared at the page, unease curling in my stomach. I hadn't thought about the words as I typed them, but they felt alive, as if they'd always existed, and I'd simply unearthed them. The second letter arrived the next morning. It was longer this time, written in the same sharp, precise style. Dear Mr. Green, you've begun well. The story unfolds as it should. Continue. Sincerely, Elias. I tore the letter in half and threw it away. Something was wrong, very wrong, but I couldn't explain it. The typewriter felt like an anchor now, its presence in the room oppressive yet magnetic. I tried to ignore it, leaving the house for long stretches, but every time I returned, it was there, waiting. By the end of the week, the typewriter had begun to change. The once pristine steel frame was tarnished now, streaked with what looked like soot. The keys clicked louder, the sound echoing unnaturally in the quiet room. And the paper it produced wasn't mine. I hadn't touched it in days, yet pages of text appeared each morning, filled with fragments of a story about Elias. The boy beneath the tree had grown older, his journey twisting through strange, impossible places. A forest where the trees bled sap that smelled of copper, a village where the people spoke in whispers that lingered in the air. The more I read, the more I felt as though the words weren't just describing events, they were creating them. And then, one night, I dreamed of Elias. He was standing at the edge of a dark river, his face obscured by shadow. His hands were outstretched, blood dripping from his fingers into the water below. He looked at me, though I couldn't see his eyes, and spoke a single word, right. I woke gasping, the taste of iron in my mouth. The typewriter was waiting for me, a sheet of blank paper already threaded in place. I gave in. For hours, I typed, the words flowing through me like a current. Elias's story grew darker, the boy becoming a man, his choices unraveling into violence and desperation. I felt like a passenger, my fingers moving without thought, the narrative pulling me deeper with each line. By the time I stopped, the sun was rising, and my hands were trembling. The letter that morning was different. It wasn't addressed to me. It was addressed to Elias. Dear Elias, the work is nearly done. Prepare yourself. The door will open soon. Sincerely, the author. The room felt colder as I read it, the shadows longer. The typewriter was humming faintly, a low vibration that made the air feel sharp. I wanted to destroy it, to smash it to pieces and burn the remains, but I couldn't bring myself to touch it. The final letter came 3 days later. It was waiting for me when I woke, the paper stark white against the dark wood of the desk. The letter was short, its words etched into the page as if carved. Dear Mr. Green, it is time. Finish the story. Sincerely, Elias. I sat at the typewriter, my hands trembling. The keys felt warm under my fingers, almost alive. I began to type. The last chapter was a blur, the words spilling out faster than I could process them. Elias stood before a door, its surface etched with symbols that pulsed faintly in the dark. He reached for the handle, and the door swung open, revealing a void that seemed to swallow the world around it. As he stepped through, I felt the room around me shift. The typewriter stopped. The last page slid free, the words on it glowing faintly before fading to black. The air in the room grew heavy, and I turned to see the shadows coalescing in the corner. Elias was standing there, his face no longer obscured. His eyes met mine, and for the first time, I understood. The typewriter hadn't been telling his story. It had been telling mine. And now, the author had arrived. I found the first message on the underside of my desk. It was scrawled in pencil, the letters faint and uneven, as though written by someone in a hurry or with a trembling hand. Do you see them? That was all it said. For words pressed into the wood, shallow but deliberate. The kind of thing you might scratch into your desk during a boring lecture. Except this wasn't a school desk, and I hadn't written it. The desk had come with the apartment. It was an old, heavy thing with clawed feet and a surface full of scratches and stains. I hadn't paid much attention to it when I moved in 2 weeks ago. It was just another piece of furniture left behind by the previous tenant, along with the mismatched chairs and the mirror hanging crookedly in the hallway. I didn't think much of the message at first. Maybe someone had carved it years ago, and I was only now noticing it. Still, it lingered in my mind throughout the day, an itch I couldn't quite reach. That night, I dreamed of shadows. In the dream, I was in my apartment, but it wasn't the same. The walls stretched higher than they should, disappearing into darkness. The furniture was warped, elongated, as though I were seeing it through water. The shadows were everywhere, pooling in the corners and stretching across the floor. They moved when I wasn't looking, shifting closer, darker, heavier. I woke up gasping, the sheets damp with sweat. For a long time, I lay there, staring at the ceiling, too afraid to close my eyes. The apartment was silent, but not in a comforting way. It was the kind of silence that felt alive, pressing against your skin, waiting. The second message appeared 3 days later. This time, it was etched into the wall behind the couch, just beneath the window where the light never seemed to reach. They're closer now. The handwriting was the same, jagged and uneven, but it hadn't been there before. I was sure of it. I'd spent hours cleaning the apartment when I moved in, scrubbing every surface and wiping down every corner. That message hadn't been there then. I told myself it was a prank. Someone had broken in while I was at work, carved the words into the wall, and left without taking anything. It wasn't a good explanation, but it was the only one that made sense. I locked all the doors and windows, checked every room twice, and went to bed with a heavy kitchen knife on the nightstand. That night, the shadows came back. This time, they had form. They weren't just patches of darkness creeping along the floor. They were shapes, humanoid but wrong. Their edges blurred, shifting like smoke, and their movements were jerky, unnatural, like a video skipping frames. They didn't speak, but I could feel them watching me. Their eyes, if they had eyes, fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. When I woke, the air in the apartment was heavy, as though the dream had left a residue behind. The mirror in the hallway was tilted further to one side. The nails that held it up bent at odd angles. I straightened it, but as soon as I stepped away, it tipped again, hanging crookedly like it was mocking me. I found the third message later that day. It was on the bathroom mirror, written in something greasy and dark that smeared when I tried to wipe it away. Don't let them in. I stared at the words for a long time, my pulse pounding in my ears. The bathroom had no windows, and I'd locked the door behind me. There was no way someone could have written it while I was inside. I scrubbed at the glass until the message was gone, but even then, I could still see it faintly in the reflection, as though it had been etched into the surface. That night, I didn't sleep. I stayed on the couch, the knife in my hand. Every light in the apartment turned on. The shadows didn't come, but I could feel them. The air was thick and heavy, the edges of the room darker than they should have been, like the light didn't quite reach. The fourth message came a week later. I woke up to find it carved into the wooden floor at the foot of my bed. They're inside. I left the apartment that day. I packed a bag with whatever I could carry and checked into a motel on the other side of town. It was a cheap, dingy place with thin walls and a bed that smelled faintly of mildew, but I didn't care. I just needed to be somewhere else, somewhere safe. For the first time in weeks, I slept without dreaming. When I woke, the bag was gone. The motel room was exactly as I'd left it. Same cracked wallpaper, same flickering overhead light, but my bag was nowhere to be found. I searched every corner, even the bathroom, but it was gone. I went to the front desk to ask the clerk if anyone had been in my room, but he just gave me a blank look. "Nobody's been here," he said, his tone flat, uninterested. "You sure you didn't leave it somewhere?" That night, the shadows came to the motel. They were waiting for me when I turned off the light, darker than the room around them, their shapes shifting and writhing like smoke caught in a breeze. I turned the light back on, and they vanished, but the air stayed heavy, electric. The fifth message was on the ceiling. "It's too late." I left the motel and went back to the apartment. I don't know why. Maybe I thought running didn't matter anymore. Maybe I thought the shadows wouldn't follow me there. The apartment was exactly as I'd left it, but the air felt different. Lighter. Almost. For a moment, I let myself believe it was over, that I was safe. Then I saw the mirror. The reflection wasn't mine. It was the same apartment, the same room, but the person standing in the mirror wasn't me. They had my face, my clothes, but their eyes were wrong. Empty, dark, like the spaces between stars. They smiled. The lights went out. When I woke, I was standing in the hallway, the knife still clutched in my hand. The mirror was gone. There's nothing in the apartment now. No furniture, no messages, no shadows. Just me, and the empty walls, and the faint sound of scratching that I can't quite place. The sound of rain on the roof was the only thing that kept me grounded. I'd always found comfort in the rhythmic tapping, the way it softened the edges of the world and made everything feel quieter. That night, I needed it. The day had been long, filled with nothing remarkable, but enough minor frustrations to leave me feeling raw and restless. I turned off the lights in my living room and stretched out on the couch, letting the sound of the storm wash over me. Lightning flashed faintly through the curtains, followed by a distant rumble of thunder. And then I heard it. A second rhythm. It was faint at first, like a hollow knock coming from inside the walls. I ignored it, thinking it was the old pipes in my building reacting to the rain. But the sound didn't stop. It grew louder, steadier, and it wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from the window. I froze, my eyes darting toward the darkened glass. The rain distorted the surface, tiny rivulets streaming down, but there was no mistaking the noise. A soft but deliberate tapping, like knuckles rapping on the pane. The curtains fluttered slightly in the draft, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw movement beyond the glass. Something tall, impossibly tall, leaning forward, its face inches from the window. I turned on the lamp, flooding the room with light, but the window was empty. For a long time, I sat there, heart pounding, waiting for the sound to return. When it didn't, I convinced myself it had been a branch swaying in the wind or some trick of the storm. I was wrong. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It started at work, when I caught a glimpse of something in my peripheral vision. A figure standing still near the office door, just out of focus. When I turned to look, there was nothing there. At lunch, I felt it again. An intense sensation of eyes on me, pressing into the back of my neck. I glanced around the cafeteria, but no one was looking in my direction. By the time I got home, I was jittery, my nerves frayed. The rain had stopped, leaving the air thick and heavy, and the silence in my apartment felt oppressive. I told myself I just needed to unwind, maybe pour a drink and watch something mindless until I could shake the unease. But when I opened the cabinet to grab a glass, I stopped cold. On the inside of the cabinet door, scrawled in jagged black ink, was a single word. Look. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the glass in my hand. The writing wasn't there that morning. A faint sound drew my attention, a soft scraping, like nails dragging against wood. It was coming from the front door. I approached cautiously, every nerve in my body screaming to stop. The sound grew louder, more insistent, as I reached for the doorknob. When I opened the door, the hallway was empty. But my welcome mat wasn't. Sitting squarely in the center of it was an object I hadn't seen in years. A small, weathered journal, its leather cover cracked with age. My name was etched into the front in a handwriting I recognized instantly, my own. I hadn't kept a journal since I was a teenager, and even then, I was sure I'd lost it years ago in a move. Yet here it was, as though it had never left. I picked it up, my hands trembling, and flipped it open. The pages were filled with entries I didn't remember writing, detailing moments from my life that felt familiar but slightly altered. A trip to the lake with friends that ended with someone disappearing. A birthday party where a stranger appeared in every photo, someone no one could account for. And then there were the entries about the rain. The tapping came again last night. It knows I've seen it. Don't look too long. It hates being seen. It wasn't outside this time. It was in the mirror. I slammed the journal shut, my breathing shallow. That night, I couldn't bring myself to sleep in my bedroom. Instead, I curled up on the couch, every light in the apartment blazing. The journal sat on the coffee table, its presence an unbearable weight in the corner of my vision. Sometime around midnight, the lights flickered. Once, twice. Then they went out. The apartment was plunged into darkness, and the rain began again. Harder this time, drumming against the windows like 1,000 frantic fingers. I fumbled for my phone, the glow of the screen barely cutting through the black. And then the tapping returned. Not just at the window this time. It was everywhere. The walls, the floor, the ceiling. It surrounded me, a chaotic rhythm that grew louder and louder until it felt like the apartment itself was trembling. I turned on my phone's flashlight, sweeping the beam across the room. The light landed on the window. It was there, a figure, impossibly tall and thin, its body stretching unnaturally in the dim light. Its face was blank, featureless, but I could feel it watching me. And then it moved, not toward the window, but into it, the surface rippling like water as it passed through. I stumbled back, tripping over the coffee table and crashing to the floor. The journal fell open beside me, its pages flipping wildly as though caught in a violent wind. The tapping stopped. When I looked up, the figure was gone. The lights flickered back on, and the room was silent again. The journal's pages had settled, revealing a single new entry written in the same jagged black ink I'd seen before. You look too long. I don't open the curtains anymore. I don't check the cabinets or the mirrors, and I don't leave the journal on the coffee table where it might write itself again. But every time it rains, I hear it. The tapping. Waiting. When I took the job at the archive, I expected boredom. Endless hours cataloging brittle papers and squinting at faded ink. The small office was tucked away in the basement of an old municipal building, its walls lined with rows of metal filing cabinets and towering shelves. It smelled like damp paper and dust, and my only co-worker, Claire, seemed content to spend her shifts with her headphones in, nodding along to some playlist I couldn't hear. The work was tedious, but it paid well enough, and I didn't mind the quiet. That changed the day I found the folder. It wasn't in the system. I'd been tasked with sorting a batch of misfiled documents from the 1980s, a menial job that mostly involved alphabetizing and occasionally swearing at whoever had decided to store coffee-stained receipts next to legal contracts. About halfway through the stack, I found it, a plain manila folder with no label, tucked between two unrelated reports. Inside were photos. The first one showed a house, white, 2 stories, with a sagging porch and a single broken window. It sat in the middle of a dense forest, the trees pressing close like they were trying to swallow it whole. The second photo was of the same house, but this time, the broken window was gone. It was replaced by a perfectly round hole, black and jagged, like the glass had been punched out. The third photo chilled me. It showed the house again, but now all the windows were gone. Each was replaced by a gaping black hole, and the door hung open, dark and yawning. I thumbed through the rest of the photos quickly, each one worse than the last. The house seemed to change with every shot, growing taller, the angles more warped, the walls twisting as if the structure was struggling to stay upright. By the last image, it barely looked like a house at all. It was a shape, a thing. I shoved the photos back into the folder, my hands trembling. Find something good? Claire's voice startled me, and I nearly dropped the folder. Just old photos, I said quickly, holding it out like it meant nothing. She barely glanced at it before returning to her screen. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the pictures. Something about them itched at the edges of my mind, like I'd seen the house before. Maybe in a dream, or in a memory I couldn't quite place. The next morning, the folder was gone. I searched everywhere, on my desk, in the filing cabinets, even in the trash. It wasn't just misplaced. It had vanished. Claire shrugged when I asked about it. Maybe someone came and picked it up. Stuff gets shuffled around all the time here. But no one else had been in the archive that day. The first message arrived that evening. It was an email, sent from an address I didn't recognize. unknown@nullmail.com. The subject line was blank. The body contained only one sentence. Do you want to see it? There was a link beneath the text. I deleted the email. The second message came 2 hours later, this time as a text. It's waiting for you. Attached was a single image. The first photo from the folder, the White House with the sagging porch. The third message came as a whisper. I was lying in bed, the room dark except for the faint glow of my phone on the nightstand. The voice was faint, almost too soft to hear, but it carried the same words. "It's waiting for you." I didn't sleep. The next morning, I called out sick and drove. I didn't have a destination in mind. I just needed to move, to put distance between myself and whatever was clawing at my thoughts. But no matter which road I took, I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. Around noon, I pulled into a diner, hoping for some sense of normalcy. The place was nearly empty, the kind of roadside stop where the coffee tastes like cardboard and the air smells faintly of fried onions. As I sipped my coffee, I glanced at the placemat beneath my plate. It was printed with a map of local attractions, hiking trails, historical landmarks, scenic routes. My stomach turned as I spotted it, barely noticeable in the corner of the map. A white house, deep in the woods. The description read, "The Hollow House, a local legend, said to appear only when called." I paid my bill and left, my hands shaking. The road twisted as I drove deeper into the forest. The trees pressed closer, their branches tangling overhead, blocking out the sun. My GPS had stopped working miles ago, but I didn't need it. I knew the way. When I saw it, my breath caught in my throat. The house was smaller than I'd imagined, leaning like it was trying to collapse into itself. The porch sagged, the paint peeled, and the broken window stared at me like an empty eye. I parked the car and stepped out, the air thick with the smell of damp wood and decay. As I approached the house, I felt it before I saw it. The pull, a force, subtle but undeniable, drawing me closer. The front door hung open, the darkness inside deeper than it should have been. "Do you want to see it?" The whisper came from everywhere and nowhere. I stepped through the door. The air inside was colder, the smell stronger. The walls were lined with photos, hundreds of them, pinned haphazardly, overlapping in places. Each photo was of me. Some showed me at my desk, sorting papers. Others captured moments I didn't remember. Walking to my car, sitting in my living room, sleeping. The last photo was of me standing in the doorway of the house, staring into the camera. I turned to run, but the door was gone, and the house was waiting. The plant arrived on a Tuesday, uninvited. A small pot, painted bright yellow, with a single ivy sprout curling lazily over the edge. It sat on the porch when I got home, a note tucked beneath it. "For light and love, the way you bring it." No name. At first, I thought it was a mistake, something meant for the neighbors. But the handwriting on the note, it was unmistakably his. I held it up when he got home. "What's this about?" He looked at the plant, his brow furrowed in mock confusion. "What?" "Oh, I don't know. Maybe someone left it for you? With your handwriting on the note?" He glanced at the scrap of paper and laughed. "Looks like mine, huh? Weird. I didn't leave it, though." His nonchalance was almost convincing. Almost. The plant stayed on the windowsill, its cheerful color mocking me every time I passed it. I watered it, half out of habit, half out of spite. 3 weeks later, I found the second gift. A scarf this time, folded neatly on the passenger seat of his car. It was emerald green, soft as clouds, with a faint scent of jasmine woven into its fibers. "Where did this come from?" I asked, holding it up as he came in from the garage. He barely looked at it. "Beats me. Maybe I grabbed it by mistake when I was at the cafe. Someone probably left it on the chair." I studied him, the way his hands stayed busy, adjusting his watch, smoothing his hair, like he needed a distraction. "You've never brought home someone else's things before," I said. He shrugged. "First time for everything." The scarf joined the plant on the windowsill, its bold color a strange pairing with the yellow pot. I didn't know what I was waiting for, a pattern, an answer, but the feeling of something unraveling in the corners of my life grew stronger. One Saturday morning, he announced he was going for a walk. He wasn't the walking type. "Mind if I join?" I asked, pulling on my sneakers. He hesitated, just for a moment. "Actually, I was hoping to clear my head. You know, some alone time." The silence after those words stretched long enough to answer questions I hadn't yet asked. That evening, when he fell asleep on the couch, I opened his phone. The code hadn't changed. It was still the same 4 numbers he'd chosen years ago, a combination of our birthdays. There weren't any incriminating messages, no scandalous photos. But there was a name in his call history I didn't recognize. Maya. I scrolled through the logs. The calls were frequent, sometimes late at night, sometimes during his walks. Each one lasted at least 20 minutes. Maya, I whispered to myself, testing the name in the quiet of the living room. The next day, I said nothing. I made breakfast as usual, smiling at him over the table, pretending the plant and the scarf and the calls didn't exist. But I started watching. He began coming home later, blaming traffic or errands. The plant grew taller, its vines curling further across the windowsill, and the scarf began to smell faintly of his cologne. One day, I found a bracelet beneath the driver's seat of his car, a delicate chain with a single pearl too small for my wrist. I didn't confront him. I placed the bracelet beside the plant, a collection of unspoken truths gathering on the sill. The breaking point came on a Friday night. He'd said he was working late, but when I called his office, there was no answer. I waited until 11 before grabbing my keys and heading out. His car was parked outside a small, dimly lit bar on the edge of town. Through the window, I saw him sitting at a corner table with a woman. She was beautiful, her hair a cascade of dark curls, her laughter bright enough to cut through the noise of the bar. They leaned close, his hand brushing hers as she spoke. I didn't go inside. Instead, I watched from the car, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. When he came home that night, I was waiting in the kitchen. The plant, the scarf, and the bracelet were lined up on the table, an exhibit of evidence. He stopped short when he saw them, his face betraying a flicker of recognition before settling into something carefully blank. "What's all this?" he asked, feigning ignorance. "Your souvenirs," I said, my voice steady. "From Maya." He didn't respond right away. Instead, he looked at the items on the table, as if trying to decide which lie to tell. Finally, he sighed. "It's not what you think." "Then tell me what it is." "It's complicated," he said, the words heavy with exhaustion. "Of course it is." He sat down across from me, his hands clasped tightly together. "She's a friend. Someone I met a while ago. It's nothing serious." "It doesn't look like nothing," I said, gesturing to the table. He stared at the items, his jaw tightening. I didn't mean for it to happen. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. I stood up, picking up the bracelet, the scarf, and the plant. One by one, I dropped them into the trash. When I turned back to him, he looked smaller somehow, as if the weight of his actions had finally settled on his shoulders. "You should go," I said. He opened his mouth as if to protest, but no words came. He stood, nodded, and walked toward the door without looking back. The next morning, the sunlight poured through the window, unobstructed by the ivy that had once crept across the sill. The house felt lighter, quieter, and as I sipped my coffee, I realized it wasn't emptiness I felt, it was peace. The town was small enough that no one questioned strange occurrences too much. A light flickering on an empty street, a dog barking at nothing, shadows moving where there shouldn't be any. People shrugged it off, blamed the wind, the old wiring, or just the weight of their own imaginations. But when the letters began appearing, the town couldn't explain them away. The first one showed up on the door of the old general store. A scrap of parchment, pinned with a single nail, its edges frayed like it had been torn from an ancient book. The ink was dark and spidery, the handwriting oddly elegant. "There is one among you." It was signed only with a symbol, a circle bisected by a jagged line. The store owner, Hank, laughed it off at first. He crumpled the note, tossed it in the trash, and thought nothing of it. But that same evening, his dog refused to come inside, growling low at the door until Hank finally gave up and went to bed. By morning, Hank was gone. No one saw him leave. His truck was still in the driveway. The lights in his house were still on. The only clue was another letter pinned to his front door. "The first has been taken." It didn't take long for the town to spiral into panic. People locked their doors, pulled their kids inside before dark, and whispered theories in hushed tones. Was it a prank? A warning? A prophecy? I didn't think much of it at first. Strange things happen in small towns, but they usually fizzle out. I figured Hank had left of his own accord, tired of a life that hadn't changed in decades. The letters were probably some overzealous kid trying to scare people, but then I found the letter on my door. I didn't notice it until I got home from work. It was pinned right in the center, the same parchment, the same ink, the same strange symbol. But this one wasn't cryptic. "You've been marked." My heart stuttered. I looked around, half expecting to see someone hiding nearby, watching, waiting for my reaction. The street was empty, the late afternoon light casting long, sharp shadows across the pavement. I took the letter inside, holding it gingerly, as though it might burn me. It felt heavier than paper should, its texture rough and brittle. I didn't tell anyone about it, not at first. Instead, I shoved it into a drawer and tried to convince myself it was nothing. A prank, a mistake, a bad dream I hadn't woken from. But that night, the dreams came. They weren't like normal dreams, with their disjointed logic and hazy edges. These were vivid, painfully clear, as though I were watching something real. I stood in the center of the town, the streets deserted, the windows of the houses dark. Above me, the sky churned with roiling clouds that seemed too close, pressing down on the earth like a lid. In the distance, a figure stood. They were tall and thin, their silhouette sharp against the unnatural glow of the horizon. They didn't move, but their presence radiated something I couldn't describe, like gravity, pulling everything toward them. I woke with the sensation of falling. My sheets were damp with sweat, my chest tight, my pulse pounding in my ears. The letter was on my nightstand. I knew I hadn't put it there. The next morning, the whispers in town had grown louder. Another person was missing, Mrs. Callahan, the librarian. Her door had been left ajar, and on it was another note. "The second has been taken." People began leaving town in droves, packing their cars with everything they could carry and fleeing without looking back. By the end of the week, the streets were nearly empty, the houses dark, their windows boarded up. I stayed. I didn't know why. Maybe part of me wanted to understand what was happening, to face it instead of running. Maybe I thought leaving wouldn't make a difference. The letters kept coming. Each one was addressed to me. They were shorter now, more direct. "You know what you must do. It waits for you. The end begins with you." I didn't know what they meant, but the dreams became clearer, the figure closer. Each night, they stood a little nearer, their features sharpening into focus. Their eyes glowed faintly, not with light, but with something deeper, something alive. On the seventh night, I woke to find the figure standing at the foot of my bed. I couldn't move, couldn't scream, couldn't even breathe. They leaned down slowly, their face inches from mine, and whispered a single word: "Come." When I blinked, they were gone. The final letter was waiting for me on my kitchen table. I didn't question how it got there. It was different from the others, longer, its handwriting more jagged, as though whoever wrote it had been trembling. "You have been chosen to complete the cycle. The ones before you were not enough. The town is hollow now, its purpose fulfilled. There is only one task left. You know the place. You know the way. Come willingly, or it will come for you." There was no signature. I don't remember leaving my house. I don't remember locking the door behind me or stepping into the empty streets. But now I'm here, standing at the edge of the forest, the place that has haunted my dreams. The sky above is dark and heavy, the trees bending inward like spectators. In the distance, the figure waits, their silhouette a beacon, calling me forward. I don't know what will happen when I reach them, but I know I can't turn back. I never intended to buy the painting. It was tucked into the back corner of a dusty thrift store, propped against a stack of yellowed encyclopedias. The canvas was warped, the frame scratched and dull, but something about it caught my eye. It was a landscape, mostly. Dense trees under a sky streaked with orange and gray, a narrow path winding toward a small cabin in the distance. But there was something unsettling about it, though I couldn't put my finger on why. The store owner was eager to sell it. $5 and it's yours," she said, barely glancing up from her crossword. I didn't haggle. When I got home, I leaned it against the wall in my living room, intending to hang it later. But the longer I looked at it, the more certain I became that it had changed. The colors seemed sharper, the shadows deeper. The cabin in the distance seemed closer than I remembered. I told myself it was just my imagination. That night, I dreamed of the painting. I was standing on the narrow path, the trees towering above me, their branches knotted together like claws. The sky was darker than it had been in the painting, a heavy, stormy gray. I could see the cabin now, close enough to make out its details. A sagging roof, a crooked door, a single window that glowed faintly from within. I woke before I reached it. By the next morning, I was certain the painting had changed. The cabin was undeniably closer, and the path leading to it was no longer empty. A figure now stood on it, small and indistinct, as if painted hastily. It was facing away from me, its features obscured, but its presence made my skin crawl. I tried to tell myself I hadn't noticed it before, that the figure had always been there. But when I tried to convince myself of that, a strange certainty settled in my gut. The figure hadn't been there the day before. Over the next few days, the changes became impossible to ignore. Every time I looked at the painting, the figure had moved, creeping closer to the cabin. Its details sharpened, broad shoulders, a dark coat, hands that hung stiffly at its sides. And then, one morning, it wasn't facing away anymore. I found myself standing in front of the painting, staring at the figure's face. It wasn't a face at all, just a blank smear of pale paint where its features should have been, but its head was tilted slightly, as if it were looking at me. That night, I dreamed of the path again. I was standing in the same place, the cabin closer now. The light in the window was brighter, flickering like a flame. The figure was there too, further down the path, walking toward the cabin with slow, deliberate steps. It stopped halfway and turned. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. All I could do was watch as it raised a hand and pointed past me, towards something I couldn't see. I woke with a start, drenched in sweat. By now, I was too afraid to look at the painting, but I couldn't help myself. It had become a compulsion, a ritual. Each time I glanced at it, I half expected to see the figure climbing out of the frame. Instead, I saw something worse. The cabin was gone. The narrow path still wound through the dense forest, but the cabin at its end had vanished. The figure, too, was missing. I tore the painting from the wall and shoved it into the closet, covering it with a sheet for good measure. But that night, I dreamed again. This time, the path stretched out endlessly, twisting and looping like a labyrinth. The forest was alive, the trees shifting and groaning, their shadows forming shapes that slithered and writhed. I tried to wake myself up, but the dream wouldn't let me. The figure returned, stepping out from the trees this time. Its blank face tilted in my direction. It raised a hand again, this time pointing directly at me. When I woke, the air in my apartment was cold and heavy. The closet door was open. I didn't want to look, but my eyes were drawn to it. The sheet was crumpled on the floor, and the painting was leaning against the wall, the blank-faced figure standing in the foreground now. The forest behind it was darker, the path swallowed in shadows. I packed a bag and left that morning, checking into a motel on the other side of town. I didn't care about the lease or the rent I'd paid. I just needed to get away. For a while, it worked. The motel was quiet, its walls paper-thin but comforting in their normalcy. I convinced myself I'd overreacted, that the painting was just a strange, creepy relic of someone else's imagination. But 2 nights ago, I heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping on the motel room door. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The tapping came again, louder this time. I crept to the door and looked through the peephole. The hallway was empty. When I turned around, the painting was sitting on the bed. The figure was no longer in the forest. It was standing in the room, painted against the background of my motel walls, its blank face turned toward me. I haven't slept since. I don't know how the painting found me, or what it wants, but I can feel it now, watching me, waiting for something. And every time I blink, the figure seems closer. The train station was a place for waiting, but no one ever left. I first noticed it when I was 6, clutching my mother's hand as she led me to the platform. The station was enormous, a cathedral of metal and glass, with a vaulted ceiling that seemed to touch the sky. Its marble floors gleamed beneath the soft hum of fluorescent lights, and the air carried the faint scent of oil and ozone. People milled about, some seated on long wooden benches, others pacing with restless energy. But no one boarded the trains. I didn't realize it then. To a child, the world is what it is, and questions come slowly. My mother didn't seem to notice. She bought our tickets, checked the time on the massive clock above the platform, and handed me a sandwich from her purse. We waited. The train came. Its sleek silver body pulled into the station with a low, resonant hum, its windows dark and its doors firmly shut. The crowd barely reacted. A few people glanced up, their expressions unreadable, but no one moved toward it. After a moment, the train departed, its shadow flickering across the tiled floor like a bird in flight. Why didn't anyone get on? I asked my mother. She frowned, as though the question didn't make sense. What do you mean? That was the first time I felt it, the sense that something was not as it seemed. As I grew older, we returned to the station many times. Always the same. Tickets purchased, sandwiches eaten, trains arriving and departing with mechanical precision. But no one ever boarded. It wasn't until I was 23, sitting alone on the same worn bench I'd occupied as a child, that I decided to find out why. I hadn't planned on going to the station that day. My car had broken down, and I'd ended up walking to clear my head, following the familiar streets until I stood beneath the iron arches of its entrance. The station was quieter now, the crowds thinner, the air heavier. The clock above the platform was frozen, its hands pointing eternally to 3:17. I bought a ticket, though I didn't know where it would take me. The woman at the counter didn't ask. She handed me a slip of paper, her eyes glassy, her expression as blank as the board behind her. The train came. This time, the doors opened. No one moved. The crowd watched in silence, their faces turned toward the train but their bodies rooted to the ground. I hesitated, my heart pounding, and then I stood. The air seemed to thicken around me as I stepped forward. My feet felt heavy, as though I were wading through invisible water. The people didn't look at me, but I felt their awareness, a collective weight pressing against my back. The doors were cold beneath my fingers. I stepped inside. The interior of the train was brighter than I'd expected, its walls smooth and white, its seats upholstered in dark gray fabric. The air was sterile, humming faintly with an energy I couldn't place. I turned to look out the window, but the station was gone. Instead, the view was endless, a flat, gray expanse that stretched in every direction, broken only by the occasional flicker of movement at the edges of my vision. The train began to move, though I didn't feel it. There was no jolt, no lurch, only the steady hum that grew louder, vibrating through the floor beneath my feet. I walked through the cars, each one identical to the last, empty and pristine. The windows all showed the same unchanging expanse, a landscape that felt less like a place and more like the absence of one. Then I saw her. She sat in the last seat of the final car, her head bowed, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her hair was dark and loose, her dress pale and simple. She didn't look up as I approached, but I felt her presence like a weight in the air. "Excuse me," I said, my voice startlingly loud in the stillness. "Do you know where this train is going?" She didn't answer. I stepped closer, my reflection catching in the window beside her. The landscape outside shifted, the gray giving way to faint, swirling colors that reminded me of oil on water. "It doesn't go anywhere," she said finally, her voice soft but certain. I frowned. "Then why are we on it?" Her head turned then, her eyes meeting mine for the first time. They were dark and bottomless, not human in a way I couldn't articulate. "Because you asked," she said. The train began to slow, the hum deepening until it resonated in my chest. The colors outside coalesced into something tangible, a dense, tangled forest, its trees towering and gnarled, their branches twisting like veins. The doors opened. She stood, smoothing her dress with practiced hands, and gestured toward the exit. "It's time for you to leave." I stepped back. "What is this place? What's out there?" She didn't answer. Her face was calm, impassive, but her eyes never left mine. "I don't understand," I said. "You don't need to," she replied. "But But you can't stay. The forest outside pulsed faintly, its shadows shifting with a life of their own. My legs felt unsteady, my breath shallow, but I stepped forward, the air colder with each step. When my foot touched the ground, the train doors slid shut behind me. I turned, but the train was gone, replaced by an endless line of trees. The hum was gone, and I was alone. The apartment wasn't my first choice. It wasn't anyone's first choice, really. The building had that tired, sagging look of something resigned to being overlooked, a relic of the 1970s with no charm and even less maintenance. But the rent was cheap, and I needed cheap. So, I signed the lease and moved in, figuring I could survive anything for a year. The landlord, Mr. Grayson, was an odd man. He had the appearance of someone who lived underground. Sallow skin, sunken eyes, and a shuffling gait that made me wonder if he ever left the building. He handed me the keys without much ceremony and muttered, "Don't mess with the lock on the basement door. It's finicky." I wasn't planning to, but the way he said it made it stick in my mind. The apartment itself was unremarkable. Beige walls, a kitchen with outdated appliances, a single window overlooking the alley. There was a faint smell of mildew I couldn't quite get rid of, no matter how many candles I burned. But it was quiet, and quiet was what I needed. For the first month, nothing strange happened. I worked during the day, came home in the evenings, and spent my nights reading or scrolling mindlessly on my phone. The neighbors were polite but distant. Occasionally, I'd hear someone in the hall, but I never saw anyone long enough to learn their names. It wasn't until the second month that I noticed the tapping. It came at night, faint but deliberate, like someone lightly drumming their fingers against the wall. It was irregular, pausing for minutes or hours before starting again. At first, I thought it was coming from one of the other apartments, but no matter how much I listened, I could never pinpoint the source. It wasn't loud enough to complain about, just persistent enough to keep me awake. I asked Mr. Grayson about it one afternoon. He shrugged, his bony shoulders rising and falling like a marionette's. "Old building," he said. "Pipes, probably. They settle." That explanation didn't sit right with me, but I let it go. What else could I do? The tapping grew worse. It followed me from room to room, sometimes so soft I could almost convince myself it wasn't there. Other times so sharp it felt like it was coming from inside the walls. I started sleeping with earbuds in, blasting white noise to drown it out. But even then, I could feel it, like a faint vibration in the floorboards. One night, unable to take it anymore, I got out of bed and followed the sound. It led me to the far corner of the apartment, where the wall met the floor. I pressed my ear against the plaster, expecting to hear the rhythmic creak of pipes or the scuttle of mice. Instead, I heard something that made my stomach drop. Breathing. It was faint but unmistakable, shallow and raspy, as though someone were struggling for air. I backed away, my pulse racing, and spent the rest of the night sitting on the couch with every light in the apartment on. The next morning, I went downstairs to confront Mr. Grayson, but he wasn't in his office. The door was locked, a handwritten sign taped to the glass, "Out until further notice." I knocked anyway, hoping he was inside, but no one answered. I should have left then. I should have packed a bag, walked out the door, and never looked back. But instead, I stayed. I told myself I was overreacting, that I was imagining things. That's the thing about these kinds of moments. You always think you have more time than you do. The tapping didn't stop. If anything, it got worse. It started during the day now, sharp and insistent, like it was demanding my attention. And then, late one night, I heard the door to the basement open. The sound was unmistakable. The groan of old hinges, the creak of the steps as someone descended. I froze, my mind racing. I hadn't touched the basement door since moving in. Had one of the other tenants? Had Mr. Grayson come back? The noise stopped, and silence settled over the building like a weight. I wanted to ignore it, but something compelled me to leave my apartment and check. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped into the hallway, my heart pounding. The basement door stood ajar. I should have turned around. Every instinct screamed at me to go back to my apartment, lock the door, and wait for morning. But instead, I pushed the door open and shone my flashlight down the stairs. The beam illuminated a narrow, unfinished basement, the walls lined with shelves of old tools and boxes. At the far end of the room was another door, this one smaller, with a heavy iron lock hanging from it. The tapping was louder now, echoing in the confined space. It was coming from the other side of that door. I approached slowly, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The lock looked ancient, its surface rusted and pitted, but as I reached for it, I realized it wasn't latched. Someone, or something, had already unlocked it. The door swung open with a low groan, revealing a small, windowless room. The air inside was damp and cold, and the walls were covered in scratches, as though something had clawed at them for years. In the center of the room was a chair, and in the chair sat a figure. It was human-shaped but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its joints bending at angles that made my stomach turn. Its face was a featureless void, a smooth expanse of pale skin where eyes and a mouth should have been. And yet, I knew it was looking at me. The tapping stopped. The figure stood, its movements unnaturally fluid, and took a step toward me. I stumbled backward, dropping the flashlight. The beam swung wildly, illuminating the scratches on the walls, the marks on the floor. It had been waiting. I ran, up the stairs, through the hall, and into my apartment, slamming the door behind me. I didn't sleep that night, or the night after. By the next morning, I was gone. I don't know what I saw in that basement. I don't know if it was real, or if the isolation and sleepless nights twisted my mind into something unrecognizable. All I know is this: the tapping hasn't stopped. Even now, in a new apartment, in a new city, I hear it. Sometimes faint, sometimes loud. Always there, just out of reach. The first time I saw the crack, it was no bigger than a thread. I was washing dishes in my kitchen, staring out the window at the gray afternoon sky, when my eyes flicked downward and caught it. It ran along the edge of the countertop, just below where the granite met the backsplash. A fine, hair-thin line that shouldn't have been there. It didn't seem like a big deal. Things crack all the time, especially in older apartments like mine. I ran my finger along it absent-mindedly and forgot about it. The next day, the crack was longer. It stretched nearly the full length of the counter, jagged and uneven, like lightning frozen mid-strike. The air around it felt cooler, somehow, as though the crack was letting something in. I crouched down to look closer, tilting my head to see the way it caught the light. For a moment, I thought I could see movement. It wasn't my reflection in the polished surface, nor a trick of the light. Something was shifting inside the crack, deep within the blackness. I stared too long, and the space between my ears began to hum faintly, like an engine running somewhere distant. That night, I dreamed of it. In the dream, the crack wasn't in my countertop. It was in the floor, the walls, even the ceiling, splitting the space around me like a spider web. The edges of the cracks glowed faintly, pulsing in time with my heartbeat, and the hum had grown louder, echoing in every corner of the dream. I woke drenched in sweat, the sound still buzzing faintly in the back of my skull. When I walked into the kitchen the next morning, the crack was gone. I ran my hands over the counter, pressing my fingertips into the spot where it had been, but the surface was smooth and cold. I tried convincing myself that I'd imagined the whole thing, but the hum stayed with me, just on the edge of perception. 2 days later, I found it again. This time, it wasn't in the kitchen. It was in the living room, running along the seam where the floorboards met the wall. The crack was larger now, wide enough to fit a coin into. I crouched down to inspect it, the faint hum returning like an old friend. When I leaned closer, I could feel her leaking from the crack. It wasn't cold or warm, just different. Heavy, metallic, like the air before a thunderstorm. It carried a faint scent of something I couldn't place, a smell that wasn't entirely unpleasant but lingered too long in my nose. Old building, I muttered to myself, though the words felt hollow. The crack was gone again the next morning. This became a pattern. The crack would appear in different parts of the apartment, along the edge of a windowsill, across the bathroom tile, even running up the spine of a book I'd left open on my desk. Each time it reappeared, it was larger, more intricate. The edges seemed to branch out like veins, thin lines splitting into thinner ones, all leading back to the dark center. And the hum grew louder. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It was a presence pressing against the edges of my mind, making it harder to think, harder to breathe. One night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the hum grew so loud that it felt like the entire apartment was vibrating. I sat up, my chest tight, and saw the crack on my bedroom wall. It was huge now, splitting the wall from floor to ceiling, its jagged edges glowing faintly in the dim light. Something moved inside it. I couldn't see it clearly, just a shadow shifting in the blackness, too fluid and too large to belong to anything human. The air in the room felt thicker, heavier, as though the crack were pulling it in, swallowing the oxygen. "Who's there?" I whispered, though I wasn't sure who, or what, I was addressing. The shadow stilled, and for a long moment, the room was silent except for the hum. Then the crack widened. I didn't move. I couldn't. Something emerged, long and thin, its surface shimmering faintly like liquid metal. It stretched toward me slowly, cautiously, the way a hand might reach into the dark for something it had lost. The edges of the crack pulsed in time with my heartbeat, faster and faster, until the shimmering form was inches from my face. Then it stopped. It stayed there for what felt like hours, unmoving, waiting. The hum filled my head completely now, a low vibration that pushed against every thought, every instinct. Finally, the thing retreated, folding back into the crack as silently as it had appeared. The glow faded, the hum quieted. When I turned on the lights, the wall was whole again. But the room wasn't empty. I could feel it, whatever it was, still watching me from somewhere just beyond the surface. The cracks didn't stop after that. They spread, not just in my apartment but in places I couldn't explain. On the sidewalk outside, along the edge of my desk at work, even in the reflection of a puddle on the street. Each time I saw one, the hum returned, louder than before. And now, when I stare too long, I see the shadows again. They're not just inside the cracks anymore. They're everywhere. The day my name disappeared from my mailbox, I barely noticed. It was a small thing, after all, a minor irritation. I assumed the building's maintenance team had knocked the label off, or that the adhesive had finally given out. As I stood in the dim hallway staring at the blank metal slot where my name should have been, I thought, I'll fix it tomorrow. The next morning, I forgot. Work was chaotic, my commute even worse, and by the time I returned, the label wasn't on my mind. But as I approached my apartment, I hesitated. Something about the hallway felt unfamiliar. The peeling wallpaper seemed grayer than usual, the air heavier. When I reached my door, I froze. My apartment number, 2F, was gone. Not scratched out or defaced, just gone. A blank rectangle of wood stared back at me, as if the number had never been there. I looked around, suddenly unsure I'd come to the right door. The layout of the hallway was the same, but there was a strange, sterile quality to it, like a photograph that had been retouched too aggressively. My fingers hovered over the doorknob before I finally turned it. Inside, everything seemed normal. My furniture was where I'd left it, my keys sitting in the dish by the door. The faint scent of leftover takeout lingered in the air. I laughed at myself for being paranoid, but that night, I couldn't sleep. It wasn't a noise or a bad dream that kept me awake. It was the silence. The kind of silence that presses against your skin, thick and unnatural. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the faint glow of the street lamp filtering through my curtains. For hours, I told myself to relax, to sleep, to stop imagining things. Eventually, I must have dozed off because I woke to a sound I couldn't place. It wasn't loud, but it was deliberate, like someone shifting their weight on the creaky floorboards outside my bedroom door. My pulse quickened. I reached for my phone, but it wasn't on the nightstand where I'd left it. The sound came again, closer this time. I stayed frozen under the covers, my breath shallow, my ears straining for any sign of movement. Morning came, bringing light but no answers. My phone was on the kitchen counter, though I was certain I hadn't left it there. I pushed the memory of the footsteps to the back of my mind. Maybe it had been a dream. That evening, when I returned from work, the hallway was wrong again. This time, it was the light. The usually dim sconces flickered faintly, casting long, jittering shadows. My steps echoed more than they should have, the sound bouncing unnaturally against the walls. My door didn't have a peephole anymore. I stared at the wood, my chest tightening. The thought of opening the door felt unbearable, but the hallway felt worse. Taking a deep breath, I twisted the knob and stepped inside. The apartment was the same, or close enough. The takeout containers were still on the counter, but they didn't smell anymore. My plants were in the right spots, but the leaves were wrong. Larger, darker, almost glossy. Even the air felt heavier, like it had been sitting still for too long. Then I saw the mirror. It hung in its usual spot above the couch, its antique frame tarnished with age. But the reflection inside wasn't mine. Not quite. The room in the glass was identical to mine, down to the smallest detail. But my reflection stood too still, watching me. Its head tilted slightly, its expression faintly curious. I looked away, my stomach twisting. When I glanced back, the reflection was normal. That night, the sound returned. Louder. Closer. This time, I got up. I crept into the hallway, the old floorboards groaning beneath my feet. Nothing moved. The air was still, heavy with the faint scent of mildew. And then I saw it. The door to the apartment across the hall, a door I'd passed 100 times without noticing, was open. Just a crack, barely enough to see the darkness inside. "Hello?" I whispered. The door creaked slightly, as if responding. I don't remember walking toward it. My feet moved on their own, drawn by a pull I couldn't resist. The closer I got, the colder the air became, until I could see my breath curling in faint wisps. I pushed the door open. The apartment was empty. No furniture, no lights, no sound. Just a cavernous space that seemed to stretch further than the building should have allowed. The walls were gray, featureless, and the floor was smooth and unmarked. At the far end of the room, there was a mirror. It stood on its own, unframed and impossibly tall, its surface rippling faintly like water. My reflection was already there. It stood still, its head tilted, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite place. Amusement? Pity? I stepped closer, unable to stop myself. The air around the mirror hummed, a low, vibrating sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Don't," a voice said behind me. I turned sharply, but the room was empty. When I looked back at the mirror, my reflection was gone. The surface was still now, perfectly smooth, perfectly blank. And then I saw it. A faint outline in the glass, something standing just behind me. I ran. The hallway was empty when I stumbled back into it, my heart racing. My own apartment door was gone, replaced by smooth, featureless wood. I don't live there anymore. I moved out the next morning, packing what little I could carry and leaving the rest behind. But wherever I go, I feel it, like a faint pull in the back of my mind, a pressure that builds when I'm alone. The mirrors are the worst. Sometimes, when I'm not looking directly at them, I can see the apartment reflected in the glass, and something inside it, watching, waiting. I was 8 years old the first time I saw the holes. It was summer, the kind where the heat shimmered off the pavement and even the air felt thick. My parents had rented a cabin near a small lake, the kind of place where the cell signal faded out long before you reached the driveway. It wasn't anything fancy, just a patch of land surrounded by trees so dense the sky seemed smaller. I spent most of the first day exploring while my parents unpacked. The holes were scattered through the woods, tucked between roots and hidden under ferns. They weren't animal burrows. I knew that much even then. They were perfectly round, about the size of a dinner plate, edges smooth like they'd been cut with a tool. They went straight down, so deep that even when I dropped a rock in, I never heard it hit the bottom. When I told my dad, he laughed it off, calling them sinkholes or old drainage wells. My mom just told me to stay away from them. "They're dangerous," she said, her tone sharper than usual. I didn't listen. One evening, just before sunset, I went back into the woods. The light was slanted and golden, casting long shadows across the trees. I wanted to find more holes, to figure out where they led. I didn't tell anyone I was going. I found a new one, larger than the rest, tucked behind a fallen log. It seemed to hum faintly, a low vibration that I could feel more than hear. I crouched beside it, peering into the dark, and for the first time, I thought I saw something moving inside. Then I heard it. A voice, faint and echoing, like someone calling from far away. It wasn't clear, just a soft murmur, like words carried by the wind. I leaned closer, my heart pounding, and called out, "Hello?" The voice stopped, and then, slowly, it answered, "Help me." The words sent a chill down my spine. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The voice called again, louder this time, though still distant. "Please help me." I don't remember how long I stood there, frozen. When I finally turned and ran back to the cabin, the sun had dipped below the horizon, and the woods were darker than I'd ever seen them. I didn't tell my parents what I'd heard. The next morning, I went back. I don't know why, curiosity, maybe, or the strange pull of the voice. But when I reached the spot, the hole was gone. Not filled in or covered, but gone, as if the earth had swallowed it whole. That night, I dreamed of the woods. I was standing in front of a hole, larger than any I'd seen before. The hum was louder now, vibrating through my chest. A hand reached out from the darkness, long, thin fingers with too many joints, and grasped the edge. I woke up screaming. For years, I told myself it had been a nightmare. I forgot about the holes, the hum, the voice. Life moved on, and the memory faded into the background. A fragment of childhood strangeness I barely thought about. Until last month. I was walking home from work when I saw it. A hole in the middle of the sidewalk. It was small, perfectly round, and impossibly deep. Pedestrians stepped around it without noticing, their eyes sliding past it like it wasn't there. My heart raced as I stared down into the darkness. I thought I heard the hum again. That night, I couldn't sleep. The memory of the woods clawed its way back into my mind. Sharper now, more vivid. I started noticing the holes everywhere. In the park near my apartment, on the shoulder of the road, even in the corner of my living room. Each one was perfectly round. Each one hummed faintly. And sometimes, late at night, I heard the voice again. "Help me." It's louder now, clearer, as if whatever's calling is closer. I've tried covering the holes, filling them with dirt or stones, but it doesn't work. The next day, they're back, clean and untouched. Last night, I woke to find one at the foot of my bed. The hum was deafening, vibrating through the floor and into my bones. The voice was just a whisper now, sharp and insistent. "Let me out. I don't know what's in the holes, or why it's calling me, but I can feel it watching, waiting." The holes are everywhere now, multiplying faster than I can count. They're in the walls, the ceiling, the sky. And when I look into them, I think I see something looking back. The problem wasn't the letters themselves. It was that they kept arriving. At first, I thought it was junk mail. A white envelope, blank except for my name and address in neat black type. No return address, no postage stamp. Just sitting there in my mailbox one Thursday morning like it had dropped in from nowhere. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded into thirds. The message was short and typed, like the envelope. "You've been chosen. Watch carefully." I assumed it was a prank, or some weird marketing gimmick. I threw it away and didn't think much of it, until the next one arrived. This time, it was waiting on my desk at work. Same envelope, same neat, blocky font. I asked around, but no one admitted to seeing anyone leave it. My boss chalked it up to a secret admirer or an elaborate joke. The letter inside read, "There are things you don't see. Look closer." I tried to laugh it off, but something about the precision of it unsettled me. There was no smudge in the ink, no indentations where someone might have pressed too hard with a pen. It was sterile, perfect. When I got home that night, there was another one. This one was slid under my apartment door. "They've seen you now." That's when the unease turned into dread. I called my landlord to ask if anyone had been seen entering the building. He sounded confused. "Nobody's been around. You're on the 3rd floor, right? We'd know if someone tried to get in without a key." The letters became a daily occurrence. Each one was waiting somewhere different, on my kitchen counter, stuck to my bathroom mirror, slipped into the pocket of my coat. The messages were never long. Sometimes they made no sense at all. "It's watching you through the glass. The static isn't just noise. Don't answer the knock." I stopped throwing them away. It didn't feel like the letters were something I could ignore anymore. They weren't just letters. They were instructions, warnings. The night I realized they weren't empty threats, I was sitting on my couch, staring at the pile of envelopes on my coffee table. The TV was on in the background, tuned to some late-night show I wasn't really paying attention to. My eyes kept drifting to the window. The letter I'd found in my car earlier that day had been strange, even by the new standards of my life. Don't leave the curtains open after dark. I hadn't, but as I sat there, I became acutely aware of the slight gap where the curtains didn't quite meet. Just an inch or so of exposed glass, reflecting the dim glow of the TV. It was nothing, just a crack of darkness outside. I was halfway out of my seat to close it when something moved. It was quick, a blur of motion, like a shadow flickering across the glass. I froze, heart hammering, trying to convince myself it was just a trick of the light. But then it moved again, closer this time. I dropped to the floor, my breath catching in my throat. From the corner of my eye, I could see it, a shape, too tall and too thin to be a person, standing just beyond the glass. It didn't move like a person either. Its head tilted slowly, as if testing the limits of its own neck. The TV's glow reflected off its surface, not skin, but something darker and smoother, like polished obsidian. My phone was on the coffee table, just a few feet away, but I couldn't bring myself to move. I just lay there, pressed against the carpet, watching the thing through the crack in the curtains. It didn't leave. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep or fainted. When I woke up, the sun was rising, and the window was empty. I convinced myself it hadn't been real. Stress, sleep deprivation, an overactive imagination. But the next letter didn't let me hold on to that lie for long. You saw it. It knows you're looking. I stopped going to work. I stopped leaving the apartment at all, afraid of what might be waiting for me outside. The letters kept coming, piling up in corners of my home I couldn't even remember being in. Every drawer I opened, every jacket I picked up, it didn't matter. They were there. Do not listen to the static. Keep the lights on after midnight. It is not alone. On the 9th day, I woke up to find the words scrawled directly on my bedroom wall. Not typed this time, but written in thin, black lines, like a single stroke repeated endlessly to form the letters. You're almost out of time. That night, I sat in the dark. I didn't want to see it again, whatever it was, but part of me had grown tired of running from something I couldn't escape. At 3:14 a.m., the power went out. The silence was absolute, save for my breathing and the faint creak of the floorboards beneath my feet. I stayed where I was, rooted to the couch, until I heard it. A knock. It wasn't at the door. It came from the window. I didn't look. I couldn't. The knocking grew louder, more insistent, accompanied by a low, guttural hum that vibrated through my chest. The letters had told me not to answer, but they hadn't told me what would happen if I didn't. The hum grew into a roar, shaking the walls. Then, just as suddenly, it stopped. The lights came back on. In the middle of my living room floor was a new letter. I opened it with trembling hands, my vision swimming. You're safe for now, but only for now. I moved out the next day, leaving everything behind. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, hoping distance would be enough to break the chain. It didn't work. The first letter arrived in my new mailbox 2 weeks later. You forgot to close the curtains. I don't sleep anymore. I don't open my mail. But no matter where I go, I can feel it watching. The first time I noticed the cracks in reality, I was walking home from work. It was late, and the streets were mostly empty, save for the occasional blur of headlights sweeping past. I took the same route every evening, a straight line from my office to my apartment, passing the same convenience store, the same park, the same flickering street lamp on the corner of Birch and Leland. But that night, as I turned the corner onto my street, the park wasn't there. At first, I thought I'd simply taken a wrong turn. The park should have been on my right, with its iron gate and the cluster of swings swaying gently in the breeze. Instead, there was a laundromat, its neon, open 24 hours, sign buzzing faintly in the silence. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. I knew this area. There had never been a laundromat here. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself I'd simply missed a block or two. It wasn't impossible. I was tired, distracted. I walked back the way I'd come, retracing my steps, but the park didn't reappear. The laundromat was still there, the fluorescent glow of its interior spilling out onto the sidewalk. I thought about going inside, asking if the park had been demolished or moved, but something about the place felt wrong. It was too quiet, too sterile. The few people visible through the glass sat rigidly on plastic chairs, staring at the spinning machines with vacant expressions. I turned away and hurried home, the unease clinging to me like a second skin. The next morning, I walked back to the corner, hoping that daylight would make everything feel normal again. The park was back, exactly where it had always been. The gate gleamed in the sun, the swings creaked softly in the breeze, and children chased each other across the grass. I wanted to believe it had all been a trick of my imagination, but it wasn't the last time I'd find the world rearranged. 2 days later, the street outside my apartment grew longer. What should have been a 3-minute walk to the bus stop became 15, the rows of buildings stretching endlessly ahead of me. The businesses I passed were subtly wrong. A bakery I'd visited 100 times now sold bicycles, its cheerful sign replaced with a crude, hand-painted banner. A small bookstore had become a boarded-up husk overnight. I asked my neighbors if they'd noticed the changes, but they just stared at me like I was speaking another language. "It's always been like that," one of them said with a shrug, gesturing toward the altered bakery. "Maybe you're thinking of somewhere else." The certainty in her voice unsettled me more than the shifting landscape. The changes became more frequent after that. I'd wake up to find the view from my bedroom window had shifted, the skyline altered, the buildings painted in unfamiliar colors. Street names changed overnight, and familiar landmarks vanished without explanation. But the worst part wasn't the places, it was the people. It started with my coworkers. I noticed small inconsistencies at first. A mole on Lauren's face that I swore hadn't been there the day before. James switching from glasses to contacts without comment. Then it became more noticeable. Conversations I remembered having were met with blank stares. Inside jokes fell flat, met with confused smiles. Lauren started calling me the wrong name, Evelyn, insisting she'd always called me that. My own reflection betrayed me next. I was brushing my teeth when I noticed the scar, a thin, pale line bisecting my left eyebrow, as though I'd been injured as a child. I touched it, the skin faintly raised beneath my fingers, but I had no memory of ever being hurt. The scar grew larger every day. One morning, I woke to find my hair an inch shorter than it had been when I went to bed. The next, my right hand bore a faint bruise around the knuckles, as if I'd been in a fight. My wardrobe shifted subtly, shirts I didn't remember buying, a pair of boots that were too big for my feet. The apartment wasn't immune, either. The wallpaper in my living room changed from beige to a pale green overnight. My bed creaked in ways it never had before, the wood warped as though it had been swapped for another. Even my photographs shifted. Smiling faces of friends and family blurred at the edges, their features becoming indistinct, their clothes replaced with strange, unfamiliar styles. I stopped leaving my apartment. The outside world was worse. Streets looped back on themselves, sending me in circles no matter which direction I turned. The sky hung too low, clouds pressing against the tops of buildings. The people I passed stared at me for too long, their expressions flat and unreadable. One night, I saw a man standing under the flickering street lamp outside my window. He was dressed in black, his features obscured by shadow, but I could feel his gaze locked on me. I closed the blinds and turned off the lights, but when I peeked again, he hadn't moved. He stayed there all night. When morning came, he was gone, but his presence lingered like a bruise. I tried calling for help. Friends, family, anyone who might pull me out of whatever was happening. But the voices on the other end of the line sounded wrong, too slow, too deliberate. They asked me questions they shouldn't have known to ask. "Do you remember the park?" one voice asked, crackling faintly through the receiver. I hung up and unplugged the phone. The man under the street lamp came back the next night. This time, he wasn't alone. A woman stood beside him, her silhouette tall and thin, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. She raised a hand and pointed at my window. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, The hallway outside my apartment stretched into infinity. The floorboards groaned under my feet as I walked, the light fixtures buzzing overhead. Each door I passed looked identical, blank and featureless. When I turned to go back, my apartment door was gone. I don't know where I am now. The hallways never end, and every door I open leads to more of the same. Sometimes I hear footsteps behind me, soft and measured, but when I turn, there's nothing there. The mirrors here don't show my reflection anymore. They show them. The man in black, the woman with the tilted head. Others I don't recognize, their faces blurred like smudged ink. They watch me through the glass, their hands pressed against the surface, waiting. I'm afraid to look too long, because sometimes I think I see myself standing among them, smiling. It was the calendar that caught my attention first. A plain, store-bought thing hanging lopsided on the wall of my new apartment. It wasn't mine. I hadn't hung it there, and I was certain it hadn't been in the place when I toured it. But there it was, dangling from a crooked nail, a single black X marked over the date 3 days ago. I'd moved in that morning, my car stuffed with boxes of clothes and kitchen supplies, the kind of things you accumulate without thinking until you have to haul them up 3 flights of stairs. I was too tired to question it at first. Someone probably left it behind. Maybe maintenance had used the unit for storage, or a painter had taken a break between coats. It wasn't worth the energy to care. The first night passed uneventfully. The building was old, creaky floors, thin walls, the occasional groan of plumbing. But it was charming in a way I'd convinced myself I liked. That was the point of moving here, wasn't it? Starting fresh, leaving behind the sterile monotony of my last apartment and everything that had come with it. The next morning, I noticed the calendar again as I brewed my coffee. There was a new X drawn over yesterday's date. I froze mid-pour, my hand trembling slightly as I stared at it. I hadn't touched it. I was sure of that. I tried to reason it out. Maybe I had marked it and forgotten in the haze of unpacking. Maybe it was one of those quirks of moving, the brain playing tricks on itself in unfamiliar surroundings. Still, I couldn't quite shake the unease that settled in my chest. By midday, I'd almost convinced myself it didn't matter. I spent the day unpacking, arranging furniture, hanging artwork. The apartment started to feel more like mine, less like a set of rooms with someone else's ghost clinging to the corners. But that night, as I stood in the kitchen washing dishes, I heard it. A faint scrape. I turned toward the sound, heart pounding. It came again, soft, deliberate, like a chair dragging slowly across a floor. The sound was above me, coming from the attic. The apartment didn't have an attic. I stared at the ceiling for a long moment, my pulse loud in my ears. It wasn't possible. This was the top floor. Above me was only the roof. I told myself it had to be a bird or a squirrel, some small animal that had gotten into the crawl space. That's what old buildings were like, weren't they? Drafty, alive with the noises of things you couldn't see. I went to bed, telling myself I'd call the landlord in the morning, but sleep didn't come easily. The scrape echoed in my mind, replaying itself over and over, as if daring me to question what I'd heard. The next morning, I checked the calendar again. Another X. This one was heavier, the lines thicker, as though someone had pressed harder with the pen. I stared at it, my stomach knotting. I took it off the wall, flipping through the pages. It was empty. No notes, no doodles, just blank squares stretching into the months ahead. Except for the dates marked with black XS. They were scattered through the pages at random intervals, some clustered close together, others spaced weeks apart. The next one was 6 days from now. I wanted to throw it away, to rip it from the nail and toss it into the trash. But something stopped me. Curiosity, maybe, or fear. I put it back and stepped away, telling myself again and again that there was an explanation. There had to be. The noises came again that night. This time, it wasn't just scraping. I heard faint whispers, low and rhythmic, like voices speaking just out of reach. I strained to make out the words, but they were garbled, lost in the drone of the building around me. The next day, I called the landlord. He seemed annoyed by my questions, brushing off my concerns with vague reassurances. Old buildings make noise, he said. Could be the pipes or the wind. Nothing to worry about. I pressed him about the calendar, but he claimed not to know anything about it. The fourth night, the whispers grew louder. I stayed up late, sitting in the living room with all the lights on, clutching my phone like a talisman. Around 2 a.m., the whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a sharp, deliberate knock. 3 times, loud enough to rattle the walls. It wasn't at the door. The knock came from above. I grabbed a flashlight and climbed onto a chair, pushing open the small hatch in the ceiling that led to the crawl space. The air that hit me was cold, damp, carrying a faint metallic smell that made my stomach turn. I aimed the flashlight into the darkness, the beam cutting through layers of dust and cobwebs. The space was empty, save for one thing: a chair. It sat in the middle of the crawl space, old and wooden, with deep grooves worn into the arms. Something was carved into the backrest, a shape I couldn't quite make out, but that sent a shiver down my spine. I pulled back quickly, slamming the hatch shut and bolting down the ladder. That was the night I decided to leave. I packed a bag and checked into a motel, telling myself I'd return the next day to deal with the rest of my things. But when morning came, I couldn't bring myself to go back. A week later, I got a call from the landlord. He sounded annoyed, impatient, asking why I hadn't paid rent or responded to his messages. I told him I wasn't coming back, that something was wrong with the apartment. He laughed. "You're not the first to say that." "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice shaking. "There's always something with that unit. People complain about noises, strange things happening. Most don't last more than a month. You're not the first to leave suddenly either." I wanted to scream at him, to demand why he hadn't told me. But instead, I hung up. I couldn't bring myself to hear any more. I never went back for my things. I found a new apartment, smaller and more expensive, but quiet in a way that felt safe. The calendar still haunts me, though. Sometimes, late at night, I think about the next date, the next X. I wonder what happened on those days, what the calendar was counting down to. I wonder what will happen when the dates run out. The first time I saw the house, I knew it shouldn't be there. It wasn't the type of house you'd stumble upon by accident, not in the middle of downtown where every square inch was claimed by office buildings and coffee shops. But there it was, squeezed between a dry cleaner and a shuttered bakery. A narrow, 3-story Victorian with darkened windows and peeling paint. I walked past it every day on my way to work, and every day, something about it gnawed at me. The proportions were strange. The roof pitched at angles that didn't seem structurally sound. The front door had no handle, just a small brass plate engraved with a symbol that reminded me of a knot tied too tightly. I asked people about it, the regulars at the coffee shop next door, the clerk at the convenience store on the corner. No one seemed to notice the house, let alone acknowledge it. "What house?" they'd say, looking genuinely puzzled. So one evening, after weeks of resisting the urge, I stopped in front of it. The street was quieter than usual, the city sounds muffled like I'd stepped into a vacuum. I looked up at the windows, all dark except for one on the top floor, where a faint orange glow flickered. And then the door opened. There was no sound, no creak of hinges or click of a latch, just a seamless shift as it swung inward, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. A smell wafted out, faintly metallic and sweet, like burnt sugar left too long on a stovetop. I should have walked away, but instead, I stepped inside. The door closed behind me without a sound, the air sealing itself tightly against the outside world. The space wasn't right. The house looked narrow from the street, but the inside stretched impossibly wide, the walls fading into shadowy expanses that felt more like a cavern than a building. The floor was made of uneven wood planks that groaned faintly under my weight, and the air was thick with the scent of mildew and something older, something I couldn't name. Ahead of me, a staircase spiraled upward, its banister carved with the same knot-like patterns as the brass plate on the door. The orange glow I'd seen from the street flickered somewhere above, casting faint shadows that danced like restless figures. I climbed. The stairs creaked with each step, the sound absorbed by the strange, heavy air. The higher I went, the more the smell changed, less metallic, more earthy, like damp soil freshly turned. When I reached the top, I found myself in a narrow hallway lined with doors. Each door was different. One was painted bright red, its surface cracked and peeling. Another was sleek and modern, a polished black slab with no handle. A third looked ancient, its wood warped and studded with rusting nails. But it was the fourth door that drew me in. It was small, barely 4 feet tall, and painted a deep green that reminded me of forests at dusk. Unlike the others, it was slightly ajar, the faint orange glow spilling out into the hallway. I crouched and peered inside. The room beyond was tiny, more like a crawl space than an actual room. The walls were covered in faded, floral wallpaper that seemed to writhe in the flickering light. At the center of the room sat a small table, and on the table was a clock. The clock was old, with tarnished brass edges and a face that ticked unevenly, its hands stuttering as if caught on something. Beside it lay an envelope, unmarked and yellowed with age. I stepped inside, my head brushing the low ceiling, and picked up the envelope. It wasn't sealed. Inside was a single scrap of paper, the handwriting jagged and uneven. It's already begun. I didn't hear the door close behind me. When I turned to leave, the hallway was gone. The room had expanded, the walls stretching outward into darkness. The table was still there, but the clock was gone, replaced by a tall mirror with a frame that looked like it had been twisted into shape by hand. In the mirror, my reflection stared back at me, but it wasn't me. It wore my face, my clothes, but its movements were wrong. The way it blinked, the way it tilted its head, deliberate, as though it were mimicking me. Its eyes were too bright, too knowing, as if it had been waiting for me to notice. The mirror shifted. The reflection stepped forward, out of the frame. I stumbled back, my hands brushing against the now bare table. The air crackled faintly, the faint scent of burnt sugar returning as the figure took another step. "What are you?" I managed to whisper. It didn't respond. Instead, it raised one hand, my hand, and pointed to the envelope still clutched in my fingers. Before I could react, the figure dissolved, collapsing into a spray of dark, shadowy tendrils that coiled around the table and disappeared into the floor. The room shifted again. I was back in the hallway, standing in front of the green door. It was closed now, and the glow was gone. The smell of burnt sugar lingered faintly in the air, mixing with the damp, earthy scent that clung to the walls. I turned to leave, my steps quick and unsteady. But as I reached the top of the staircase, I froze. The stairs weren't there anymore. The hallway stretched endlessly ahead, lined with more doors, each one slightly open, each one spilling faint, flickering light into the void. And behind me, the sound of uneven ticking began again. The forest had no name, at least none that people remembered. It lay at the edge of the village, sprawling and ancient, its trees so tightly packed that even the sunlight seemed to hesitate before entering. Locals avoided it not because of superstition, but because the forest seemed indifferent to them, as though their existence mattered as little to it as the wind or the rain. Except for Everin. Everin had been drawn to the forest since childhood, the way certain people are drawn to the sea or the stars. As a boy, he'd wandered its outer edges, leaving offerings of wild flowers and feathers he found on the ground, unsure of why he did it, but feeling it was necessary. The forest had always given him something in return, an unexpected clearing where the air smelled sweeter, or a bird with feathers so bright it looked like a splash of sunlight had taken flight. But now, as a man, the forest had changed. It began with the birds. Their songs, once a constant backdrop to his childhood explorations, had grown quieter over the years until they stopped altogether. Then the trees. Everin swore they were leaning closer, their trunks twisting subtly toward the village, their branches reaching out like long-forgotten fingers. People had begun noticing, too. Farmers complained of crops failing near the tree-line, and hunters who ventured too close returned with strange stories. Deer without eyes, paths that led them back to where they'd started, whispers that came from nowhere. The elders, pragmatic and gruff, dismissed it all. "The forest is old," they said. "Old things creak and shift. That's how it's always been." But Everin knew better. The forest wasn't creaking. It was waking. One autumn evening, as the sun bled out across the horizon, Everin found himself at the edge of the trees, staring into their depths. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and rotting leaves, a scent that clung to him like a second skin. He hadn't meant to come here. He'd only been walking to clear his head, but now that he was, it felt as though the forest had been expecting him. A branch cracked somewhere deep within, and Everin's pulse quickened. The sound wasn't alarming in itself. Animals made noise all the time, but this was different. It carried an intent, a deliberate weight that made the hairs on his arms stand on end. "Hello?" he called, the words slipping from his mouth before he could stop it. The forest didn't answer. He stepped closer, the ground soft and uneven beneath his boots. The trees loomed taller the farther in he went, their trunks so wide they looked like they'd been carved from stone. The air grew cooler, and the fading light painted the forest floor in fractured shadows. It was then that he noticed the path. It hadn't been there before. A narrow strip of earth, darker than the rest, snaking its way between the trees. It didn't look natural, too clean, too precise, as though someone or something had carved it with purpose. Against his better judgment, Everin followed it. The deeper he went, the quieter the world became. The usual forest sounds, rustling leaves, the scurry of small animals, were absent, leaving only the sound of his own breathing and the soft crunch of his footsteps. He felt as though the trees were watching him, their branches shifting ever so slightly in his peripheral vision. The path led to a clearing, though clearing felt like the wrong word. The trees had bent away from the center, their trunks arching like the ribs of some great beast. In the middle stood an altar, its surface covered in moss and lichen, as though it had been waiting here for centuries. On it sat an object, small and unassuming, a jar. Everin approached cautiously, his steps slow and deliberate. The jar was made of dark glass, so dark it seemed to drink the light around it. Its lid was sealed with a substance that looked like wax but shimmered faintly, as though alive. He reached out, hesitating only briefly before his fingers brushed its surface. The forest exhaled. The sound was deep and resonant, like wind rushing through a canyon, though there was no breeze. The trees swayed as though bowing to something unseen, and the ground beneath him trembled. Everin stumbled back, the jar still in his hand, its weight heavier than it should have been. "Everin." The voice was low, almost a growl, and it came from everywhere at once. He turned, his heart hammering against his ribs, but he was alone. "You took what was not yours." He clutched the jar tighter, the glass warming against his skin. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice unsteady. The trees groaned in response, their bark splitting in places to reveal veins of black sap. The voice came again, louder now. "Return it, or the forest will take its due." Everin glanced at the jar. The glass pulsed faintly, as though something inside it was alive, waiting. He didn't know why he couldn't put it down, why every fiber of his being screamed that leaving it behind would be worse than keeping it. "I can't," he said, though the words felt foreign, as if they weren't entirely his. The ground shook violently, and the path he'd taken began to twist, the trees closing in around it like a mouth swallowing its prey. Everin ran. Branches clawed at his face and arms, and roots reached up to trip him, but he didn't stop. The jar grew hotter in his hands, the light within it pulsing faster, brighter. Behind him, the voice roared, an inhuman sound that rattled the very air. He broke through the tree-line just as the sun dipped below the horizon, the village's dim lights flickering in the distance. The forest didn't follow, but its presence lingered, heavy and suffocating. Everin collapsed onto the ground, clutching the jar as though it were the only thing tethering him to the world. When he finally looked at it, the light inside had settled, faint and rhythmic, like a heartbeat. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him, that the forest wouldn't stop. It had let him go for now, but it would come for what he had taken. And when it did, there would be no path back. The first time I heard about the woman in apartment 6B, it was from the building super, Mitch. He was an older man, skin like worn leather and a voice that always sounded like it was on the edge of a laugh. He was fixing my kitchen faucet when he mentioned her offhandedly, like she was part of the building's charm. "She's been here forever," Mitch said, tightening a bolt. "Doesn't really come out much. Pays her rent and cash every month. Neat as clockwork. Never misses it, even if it's the middle of the night. Some folks think she's been here longer than me." He laughed, but it had no real humor. Strange one, though. Quiet, but strange. I didn't think much of it at first. Apartment 6B was at the end of the hall, past a flickering light fixture and a faded exit sign. I'd passed it a few times since moving in, but the door always looked the same. Gray paint chipped around the edges, a brass number 6 hanging slightly askew. There were never any sounds from inside. No music, no television, no murmurs of conversation. Just silence. It wasn't until I ran into her in the hallway one evening that I understood why Mitch called her strange. I was coming back from work late, juggling a grocery bag and my keys, when she stepped out of 6B. She moved so quietly that I didn't even notice her until she was just a few feet away. Her figure was tall and gaunt, her gray cardigan hanging off her frame like a curtain. She had pale, paper-thin skin stretched tight over her cheekbones and hair the color of ash. But it was her eyes that struck me the most, large, unblinking, and too dark to see the whites. They locked onto mine, and I froze mid-step, the grocery bag slipping slightly in my grip. "You're the new one," she said. Her voice was soft but flat, like a breath passing through an empty room. "Be careful. This building doesn't like strangers." I didn't know what to say. I managed a tight smile and nodded, muttering something polite as she turned and walked down the hallway. She didn't move like an old woman. Her steps were too smooth, too measured. As I fumbled to unlock my door, I realized she hadn't been carrying anything. No purse, no keys. How had she locked her door behind her? That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her words looping in my mind. The building doesn't like strangers. I told myself it was nonsense, the kind of cryptic comment people make when they're old and lonely. But I couldn't shake the memory of her voice, or the strange, hollow sound of it. A few nights later, I heard something. It was past midnight, and the building was quiet, save for the occasional groan of old pipes. I was brushing my teeth when I heard what sounded like faint humming coming from the hallway. At first, I thought it might be the neighbors, but it wasn't music. It was a single, soft note, rising and falling in a pattern that made my skin crawl. I turned off the faucet and listened, straining to hear. It was coming from the direction of 6B. Curiosity got the better of me. I opened my door just enough to peek into the hallway. The flickering light by the exit sign cast everything in a sickly glow. The humming was louder now, more distinct, and it was coming from behind her door. I stepped out, my heart pounding, and moved closer. As I reached 6B, the sound stopped abruptly. The silence was so sudden it made my ears ring. I stood there, staring at the door, trying to convince myself to go back to my apartment. And then I heard it, a faint scratching, like nails scraping lightly against wood. My breath hitched. I turned and walked quickly back to my place, locking the door behind me. The next morning, I convinced myself it was nothing. Old buildings make noises, and my mind was playing tricks on me. But as the days passed, strange things began to happen. Lights flickered more often, and sometimes the bulbs buzzed so loudly that I could hear it even with my headphones in. The air in the hallway grew colder, even though it was spring. Once, I found water pooling near the baseboards outside my door, though there hadn't been any rain. The woman from 6B didn't help. She seemed to appear at odd times, standing in the hallway or in the lobby, always watching, always silent. Her gaze unsettled me, and I began avoiding her as best I could. One night, about a month after I'd moved in, I woke up to the sound of knocking. It wasn't loud, but it was steady. 3 sharp taps, followed by a pause, then 3 more. I glanced at my phone. 3:13 a.m. The sound was coming from the hallway again. I stayed in bed, hoping it would stop, but the knocking continued. Reluctantly, I got up, wrapping myself in a robe, and opened my door. The hallway was empty. The knocking was louder now, echoing faintly, and it was coming from 6B. I shouldn't have gone. Every instinct told me to shut my door and ignore it. But something about the sound, its persistence, its rhythm, drew me in. I found myself standing outside her door, the brass 6 dangling slightly in the faint breeze that seemed to come from nowhere. The knocking stopped as I raised my hand to the doorframe. The silence was oppressive. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. There was no response. I leaned closer, and before I could stop myself, I pressed my ear to the door. Though it felt cold against my skin, and for a moment, I thought I heard breathing. Slow, steady, and far too deep to belong to an old woman. Then the door creaked open. The apartment was dark, but not completely. A faint, pulsating glow came from deeper inside, like the light of a distant fire flickering through fog. The air smelled damp and metallic, tinged with a faint sweetness that made me want to gag. My pulse thundered in my ears as I stepped inside. The layout was identical to mine. Living room, kitchen, a short hallway leading to the bedroom. But it was wrong. The walls were bare, and the floors were covered in a fine layer of black dust. The furniture was sparse and broken, chairs with missing legs and a table that sagged in the middle. The glow came from the bedroom at the end of the hall. I hesitated, every nerve in my body screaming at me to leave, but I couldn't turn away. The glow seemed to pull me forward. As I stepped into the bedroom, I saw her. She was standing in the center of the room, facing a mirror that covered the far wall. But the mirror didn't reflect her. It reflected me. My face stared back, pale and wide-eyed, even though I wasn't standing where the reflection should have been. Her dark, hollow eyes met mine in the glass. "This building doesn't like strangers," she said, her voice more echo than sound. And then she stepped into the mirror. The glow disappeared, plunging the room into darkness. I turned and ran, my breath ragged, and didn't stop until I was back in my apartment. I locked the door and shoved a chair under the handle, collapsing against the wall as my chest heaved. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. By morning, the hallway looked normal again. The light above 6B flickered faintly, but the door was closed, its brass 6 hanging crookedly in place. I thought about knocking, about asking her what I'd seen, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. I'm still here, but things have changed. The air feels heavier, and sometimes, late at night, I hear faint humming coming from the walls. I see her reflection in the mirrors when I pass, even though she isn't there. I don't think I'm a stranger anymore. I think the building has decided to keep me. The sound wasn't there when I moved in. The house had been quiet for weeks after I first got the keys. A small, 2-bedroom fixer-upper on the edge of a forest, far enough from town that the nights stretched long and silent. At first, it was everything I'd hoped for. Solitude, a place to focus on myself, and a chance to escape the noise of my old life. But now, there was the sound. It came at odd hours, faint at first, like the hum of distant machinery or the low thrum of a heartbeat. I only noticed it late at night when the rest of the world was still. I thought it might be coming from the walls. Old pipes, maybe, or wires vibrating. But when I pressed my ear against the plaster, the sound wasn't inside the walls. It was beneath them. I told myself it wasn't worth worrying about. Old houses made noises, settling foundations, creaking beams. But the sound wasn't a creak or a groan. It was rhythmic, almost deliberate, and it seemed to grow louder when I paid attention to it. One night, unable to sleep, I grabbed a flashlight and decided to check the crawl space. The access hatch was in the laundry room, a square of warped wood with rusted hinges. It hadn't been touched in years. The screws were stiff, the edges sealed with layers of grime. When I finally pried it open, a damp, earthy smell wafted up, thick and cloying. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating cobwebs and patches of dirt. The crawl space was low and cramped, barely 2 feet high, and seemed to stretch the length of the house. The ground beneath was uneven, the dirt loose and scattered. Nothing unusual, nothing threatening. And yet, the sound was louder here. I crouched at the edge of the hatch, straining to hear. It wasn't machinery, after all. It was something softer, more organic, like the faint rustle of leaves, but slower. Something moved. It was subtle, just a shift in the shadows at the farthest edge of the beam, but it was enough to make my skin crawl. I slammed the hatch shut and didn't open it again. That should have been the end of it. But the sound didn't stop. It followed me through the house, a low, insistent hum that grew louder at night. Some evenings, it seemed to come from the floorboards directly beneath me, vibrating just faintly enough to be felt. I tried to ignore it, to drown it out with music or the television, but nothing worked. The sound wasn't just noise anymore. It was intrusive, burrowing into my mind like a splinter. And then things started moving. Small things at first. A chair pulled slightly away from the table. A glass knocked over in the sink. A book left open on the couch, even though I hadn't touched it. I chalked it up to forgetfulness. I was stressed, exhausted. I probably wasn't noticing where I left things. But one morning, I found muddy footprints leading from the laundry room to the living room. Bare feet, small, the kind you'd expect from a child. I didn't want to open the hatch again, but I had to know. This time, I didn't go alone. I brought a neighbor, a retired contractor named Bill who lived a mile down the road. He had a calm, no-nonsense way about him that I hoped would anchor my spiraling thoughts. Bill climbed halfway into the crawl space, grunting as he maneuvered the flashlight around. I stood behind him, clutching the edge of the hatch, my heart pounding. "Looks normal to me," he said, his voice muffled. "Just dirt and junk. Could use some pest control, though. You got a bad smell down here." He shuffled further inside, the beam of his flashlight bouncing across the dirt. "Wait," he said suddenly. My stomach twisted. "What?" "There's something dug out here. Like a tunnel. Could be an animal, but—" His voice cut off. "Bill?" No answer. The flashlight flickered once, twice, then went out. I stood frozen, my breath caught in my throat, until his scream shattered the silence. It wasn't a sharp, sudden sound. It was long, guttural, filled with a raw, primal terror that sent every nerve in my body into overdrive. And then he was gone. I slammed the hatch shut and locked it, my hands trembling so badly I could barely grip the latch. I didn't sleep that night. The police came the next morning. I didn't tell them the whole story, just that Bill had gone under the house to check something and hadn't come back. They searched the crawl space, but they didn't find him. They found the tunnel, though. It wasn't an animal burrow. It was deliberate, carved into the dirt with precision, and it didn't end under the house. It stretched deep into the earth, winding downward into darkness. The officers didn't want to go further. They said it wasn't their job to explore unmarked tunnels, and that I should call someone else, maybe a geological team or an urban planning department. They left me with no answers and a sinking feeling that I was very, very alone. That night, the sound came back. It was louder now, sharper, accompanied by something else, a faint scratching, like nails dragging across wood. And when I went to bed, I found dirt smeared across my sheets. I'm not staying here anymore. I don't know what's under this house, and I don't care. Whatever it is, it's waiting, and it's getting closer. The first time I noticed the house on Hollow Street, I was walking home after a late shift. The sky was heavy with clouds, and the usual hum of the town had quieted, leaving the streets deserted. I took a shortcut through a neighborhood I didn't know well, my feet crunching on the uneven gravel of an unlit road. That's when I saw it. The house was tall and narrow, squeezed between two others as if it had been an afterthought. Its windows glowed faintly, though I couldn't see any light inside. The wood siding was weathered, a dull gray that seemed to drink in the dim light from the street lamp nearby. A wrought iron gate surrounded it, the kind that looked decorative until you realized how sharp the points were. I hadn't noticed the house before, but that wasn't strange. The town had pockets like this, places that felt off the map, even though they were right in the middle of it. I might have just passed it a dozen times without paying attention. Still, there was something about it that made me linger. I stood on the sidewalk, staring up at the crooked roof, and for a moment, I thought I saw movement behind one of the windows. A flicker, like a shadow passing too quickly to follow. The air around the house felt colder, a chill that didn't match the mild October night. I turned away, telling myself I was imagining things. By the time I reached my apartment, I'd convinced myself it was nothing. But the house stayed with me, lingering in the back of my mind like a memory I couldn't place. 2 nights later, I saw it again. This time, it was impossible to miss. It wasn't on Hollow Street anymore. It was on the corner of my own block. I stopped in my tracks, my stomach twisting. The same narrow structure, the same dull wood, the same faint glow in the windows. Even the gate was identical, the iron points catching the pale light of the moon. It was like the house had followed me. I told myself it couldn't be the same one. There were plenty of old houses in town, and I'd probably just confused the details. But when I walked past, I noticed the numbers on the door, 417. The same as before. I didn't sleep well that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured the house. Its windows, its gate, the way it seemed to loom over the street despite its narrowness. At one point, I dreamed I was inside it, wandering through a maze of hallways that twisted back on themselves. The walls were damp, and the air smelled like rotting wood. When I woke, I was drenched in sweat, my heart racing. The next day, I took a different route to work, avoiding Hollow Street entirely. But as I turned a corner near the main road, I froze. The house was there again, nestled between a bakery and a convenience store. It didn't belong. The other buildings were neat and bright, their signs cheerful, but the house looked as though it had been dragged from another world and dropped there by mistake. This time, I couldn't ignore it. I crossed the street, keeping my eyes on the windows as I approached. The glow was dimmer now, almost as if the house knew I was watching. I stepped closer to the gate, my hand brushing the cold iron. The air around me felt heavy, charged with something I couldn't name. Then I heard it, a faint creak, like a door opening slowly. My breath caught as I looked up. The front door had swung open, revealing nothing but darkness inside. It wasn't an inviting gesture. It felt like the house was daring me to come closer. My feet didn't move. I stood frozen, staring into the void beyond the threshold, until a gust of wind slammed the door shut with a sound that echoed down the empty street. I backed away, my chest tight, and hurried to work without looking back. For the rest of the day, I couldn't focus. The house was all I could think about. I didn't tell anyone. It wasn't the kind of thing you could explain without sounding crazy. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. Houses didn't just appear and disappear. They didn't follow people. That night, the dreams returned. I was inside the house again, the hallways stretching endlessly before me. This time, I could hear something, a low, rhythmic sound, like footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, echoing in the distance but growing louder. I tried to turn, to find a way out, but the hallways twisted around me, leading me back to the same spot over and over. The footsteps grew closer, their cadence steady, until I woke up gasping for air. The house didn't wait for me to find it after that. The next evening, it was outside my apartment building. I stared at it from my window, my hands gripping the sill. It shouldn't have been there. There was no space for it, no gap between the buildings where it could fit, but there it was, as solid and unmoving as if it had always been there. This time, the front door wasn't open. Instead, the window closest to me was different. The faint glow inside had disappeared, replaced by darkness. But in that darkness, I saw something. A figure, standing just beyond the glass. It didn't move, but I felt its gaze, heavy and unrelenting. My throat tightened, and I stumbled back from the window, pulling the curtains shut. I couldn't stay in the apartment. I grabbed my keys and left, not sure where I was going but desperate to get away. The streets were empty, the silence pressing against me as I walked. I didn't look behind me, but I could feel it, the house. It was following me now, not waiting for me to stumble across it. When I finally stopped, I was back where it all began, Hollow Street. And there it was, standing in its original spot as if it had never moved. The front door was open again, the darkness inside deeper than ever. This time, I couldn't resist. Something pulled me forward, a force stronger than fear, stronger than reason. My feet carried me to the threshold, and before I could stop myself, I stepped inside. The air was thick, damp, and suffocating. The door slammed shut behind me, plunging the room into darkness. I reached for my phone, fumbling to turn on the flashlight, but the beam barely pierced the gloom. The hallway stretched ahead, just as it had in my dreams, its walls pulsing faintly as though alive. I walked forward, each step echoing in the oppressive silence. The footsteps from my dreams returned, louder now, coming from somewhere ahead. Or was it behind? I couldn't tell. The sound surrounded me, growing closer with each step. When I reached the end of the hallway, there was a mirror. It was tall and cracked, its surface warped. I saw myself in it, but not quite. My reflection was wrong. Its eyes too bright, its smile too wide. It raised a hand, but I hadn't moved, and then it stepped forward, out of the mirror. I tried to run, but the hallway closed in around me, the walls twisting and bending until there was nowhere left to go. The last thing I saw was the figure reaching for me, its smile stretching impossibly wide. When I woke, I was back in my apartment. The house was gone, as if it had never existed. But the mirror in my bedroom is different now. Its surface is cracked, and when I look into it, I see something watching me from the other side. I had only lived in the new apartment for a month when I discovered the notebook. The building was unremarkable, a squat brick structure wedged between a laundromat and a deli. The rent was affordable, and the super had mentioned, almost apologetically, that the last tenant left in a hurry. Happens sometimes, he'd said with a shrug, as if tenants vanishing was as natural as the changing seasons. The notebook was tucked behind the radiator in the living room, wedged so deeply I wouldn't have found it if I hadn't dropped my phone trying to plug in a lamp. The cover was soft, black leather, with no title or markings except for a faint scuff on one corner. When I opened it, I saw the first entry. Do not go to the window after 2:33 a.m. The handwriting was small and neat, each letter carefully formed. Beneath the warning was a date, scribbled hastily, for months earlier. I laughed, half from unease and half from genuine amusement. It felt like the setup to a bad urban legend, the kind you tell at sleepovers to freak out your friends. But something about the specificity of it stuck with me. The time, the exactness. Not just late at night, but 2:33 a.m. The rest of the notebook was blank. I tossed it onto my coffee table and tried not to think about it. That night, sleep came reluctantly. The radiator hissed and groaned like an animal in pain, and the thin walls let through every sound of the building. Footsteps above me, muffled conversations, the rhythmic creak of a bed frame. When I rolled over to check the time, it was 2:27 a.m. I hadn't been thinking about the notebook, but now the warning blared in my mind like an alarm. Do not go to the window after 2:33 a.m. I told myself it was nonsense, someone's idea of a joke, or maybe a failed piece of writing practice. But the more I tried to ignore it, the heavier the air seemed to grow. At 2:32 a.m., the sound began. It was faint at first, like a distant wind rattling through trees. But it grew louder, deeper, vibrating through the walls in a way no wind could. A low, resonant hum, pulsing in uneven intervals, as though some enormous machine was spinning up somewhere in the distance. I froze, clutching the blanket against my chest. The hum seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. My fingers twitched toward the edge of the curtain. The window was only a few feet away. 2:33 a.m. The sound stopped. The silence was immediate and absolute, so abrupt it made my ears ring. For a long time, I lay there, staring at the ceiling, too scared to move. In the morning, I convinced myself I'd imagined it. That day, I bought a thick curtain rod and blackout curtains, hanging them over the window as if that would fix anything. The notebook stayed on the coffee table, untouched, but I couldn't bring myself to throw it away. The next night, the sound came again. This time, it started earlier, at 2:29 a.m. The same low hum, but louder now, deeper, vibrating through my chest like the growl of some enormous creature. I didn't look. The following morning, I found a second entry in the notebook. If you hear the knocking, do not answer. My stomach dropped. I was certain the notebook had been blank after the first entry. I checked, flipping through its pages over and over again. Now, beneath the second warning, was another date, yesterday's. The next night, the knocking came. It started at 2:31 a.m., a soft but deliberate tapping on the window. 3 knocks, perfectly spaced, like someone testing the glass. I didn't move. The knocking came again, louder this time. 3 sharp taps, each one precise, as if the knocker was waiting for a response. I pressed my back against the headboard, pulling the blanket over my head like a child hiding from a monster. The air felt thick, pressing against my skin, and the knocking didn't stop. I don't know how long it lasted. Maybe minutes, maybe hours. All I know is that when I woke the next morning, my blackout curtains were wide open. The notebook was waiting for me on the kitchen counter, open to a new page. Do not let it see you. I locked the window, though the rational part of me knew it wouldn't help. The curtain rod rattled faintly when I pulled the curtains shut, the sound like an unsteady heartbeat. That night, the knocking turned into scratching. It was subtle at first, like nails dragging lightly across the glass. But the sound grew more insistent, more frantic, until it was a harsh, grating screech that set my teeth on edge. I stayed in bed, trembling, my eyes squeezed shut. I could feel it on the other side of the glass, something cold and vast and hungry. When I woke the next morning, the glass was cracked. The notebook had a new entry. "You can't leave." The words blurred as I stared at them, my chest tightening with a growing sense of dread. Beneath the warning was another date, today's. I tried to leave anyway. I threw the notebook into my bag, grabbed my keys, and bolted for the door. But the moment I stepped outside, the air shifted. The street looked the same, but wrong. The buildings were taller, their edges sharper, their windows dark. The trees cast shadows that twisted and pulsed, as though they were alive. And the hum was everywhere. I don't know how I got back inside. The apartment is different now. The walls seem closer, the shadows deeper, and the window. I don't look at the window. The notebook is on the desk again, open to a blank page. But I know it won't stay blank for long. When the letter arrived, it was wedged beneath my front door, sealed with an old-fashioned wax stamp bearing no emblem. The envelope was plain, its paper slightly coarse, as though it had been handmade. My name was written on the front in a careful, steady hand. There was no return address, no sign of postage. It wasn't unusual for me to get mail slipped under my door, solicitations, neighborhood updates, but this felt different. The paper was cool against my fingers, almost damp, and there was a faint scent of salt water clinging to it. I opened it carefully, the wax cracking apart like brittle bone. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded into thirds. The words were typed, not handwritten, set in a strange, narrow font that felt oddly impersonal. The message was short. "An appointment has been scheduled for you at 7 p.m. on December 5th. Do not be late." No address, no details, just the time and a sense of foreboding that crept up my spine. December 5th was the following evening. I should have ignored it. A prank, surely, or some eccentric mistake. But all day at work, the letter gnawed at the edges of my thoughts. By the time I got home, the unease had solidified into something else entirely: curiosity. That night, I stayed up far later than I should have, researching anything that might explain the letter. The search yielded nothing. No similar scams, no mentions of odd mail circulating the area. The unease deepened. December 5th was cold and damp, the kind of weather that clung to your clothes and seeped into your skin. By 6:30, I had convinced myself I wasn't going. And yet, as the clock crept closer to 7, I found myself leaving the apartment. My feet carried me with a sense of purpose I didn't feel, like something outside me was deciding for me. I hadn't been given an address, but somehow I knew exactly where to go. The alley was tucked between two old, brick buildings downtown, a place I'd passed a dozen times but never really noticed. Tonight, it felt alive. The shadows were heavier, the faint hum of distant traffic muffled as though the air itself had thickened. At the far end of the alley stood a door I'd never seen before, tall and iron, set flush against the wall. It didn't have a handle, only a small circular window at eye level. A faint light glowed from within, its flicker almost imperceptible. I stood there, unsure of what to do, when the door creaked open on its own. Beyond it was a staircase, spiraling downward into darkness. The faint light came from somewhere far below, just enough to outline the rough stone steps. I told myself to turn around. I told myself this wasn't safe, wasn't normal, wasn't anything I should be a part of. But my feet were already moving. The air grew colder with each step, the light dimmer. The stone walls damp and slick beneath my fingertips. The stairs seemed endless, twisting downward in impossible loops until I was sure I must have descended farther than the depth of the buildings above. Finally, the staircase ended in a narrow corridor. The walls here were different, carved with strange, intricate patterns that seemed to shift in the flickering light. Ahead of me was another door, smaller this time, its surface engraved with symbols I didn't recognize. I hesitated before pushing it open. The room beyond was circular, its walls lined with shelves that held objects I couldn't name. At the center stood a table, its surface bare except for a single item, a large, round mirror encased in a heavy brass frame. The glass was dark, almost black, but it shimmered faintly, as though it were holding back a light just beneath its surface. A voice came from behind me, low and steady. "You're on time. That's good." I turned, startled, but no one was there. The door had closed behind me, sealing me in. The voice spoke again, this time seeming to come from the room itself. "Sit." I didn't want to. Every instinct screamed to leave, to run. But my legs carried me to the chair that had materialized before the table. I sat, the mirror now directly in front of me. The brass frame was warm to the touch, faint vibrations thrumming beneath my fingers as though it were alive. "Look," the voice commanded. I stared into the dark surface of the mirror. At first, I saw nothing. Then, slowly, shapes began to form, shadows shifting and twisting until they coalesced into an image. A man standing in a room much like this one, his back turned to me. The details were hazy, but there was something familiar about his posture, the way he tilted his head as though listening. "That's you," the voice said, "or it will be." The man in the mirror turned, and I gasped. His face was mine, but his eyes were wrong, too dark, too empty. He smiled, the expression stretching across his face like a wound, and reached toward the glass. His hand pressed against the surface, and for a moment, I felt it beneath my own skin, cold and invasive. I tried to pull away, but the chair held me in place. The voice spoke again, quieter now. "A trade must be made. Balance must be kept." "I don't understand," I stammered. "You will." The glass of the mirror rippled, and suddenly the man wasn't alone. Figures emerged from the shadows behind him, their forms indistinct but overwhelming. They didn't move like people, they flowed, their bodies bending and breaking in ways that defied logic. The man, my reflection, turned back to them, and they embraced him, their forms swallowing him whole. When he turned back to face me, his eyes weren't his anymore. They glowed faintly, like embers, and he smiled again. "Your turn," the voice whispered. The glass shattered, and the room was plunged into darkness. I don't remember how I got back to my apartment. The next thing I knew, I was sitting on my bed, shards of dark glass scattered around my feet. The mirror was gone, but its frame remained, its brass surface cold and inert. The following morning, I found another envelope under my door. It was sealed with the same wax stamp, my name written on the front. Inside was a single sheet of paper, blank except for 2 words, "Thank you." Now, every time I look into a mirror, I see him. He's always there, just out of focus, watching, waiting. And I know, someday, it will be his turn again. The first time I realized the hallway in my apartment building didn't end. I thought it was exhaustion. Long days at the office could mess with your head, stretch reality like a funhouse mirror until you didn't trust what you saw. That's what I told myself when I walked down the hallway to my apartment, passed my door without realizing, and kept walking. It wasn't until I'd gone what felt like 3 times the building's length that I stopped, blinking at the unbroken stretch of beige carpet and identical doorways. I turned around. My apartment door should have been right there, but it wasn't. The hallway stretched on in the other direction too. Same buzzing fluorescent lights, same repeating pattern of doors. I stood there for a moment, completely still, expecting a noise, a person, anything to anchor me. The silence pressed in around me like a heavy blanket. When I finally moved, I picked a direction at random and walked. My footsteps were the only sound, the muffled thud of my sneakers on carpet. I passed one door, then another, then another. They all looked the same, cheap faux wood with dull brass numbers, but none of them matched my apartment number. I felt a prick of panic in my chest. I checked my phone. No service. The screen flickered briefly, then went black, refusing to respond no matter how many times I tapped it. "Okay," I muttered to myself, trying to stave off the rising dread. "This is fine. You're just overtired." I reached for the nearest door, hoping to find a neighbor. Maybe this was a prank, or some weird power outage that made everything look unfamiliar. The brass number on the door read 316, which didn't make sense. My building only had 12 apartments per floor. I knocked. No answer. I tried the handle. It turned easily, and the door swung open with a faint creak. Inside was nothing. The room beyond wasn't an apartment. It wasn't anything at all. Just a void. An endless expanse of gray mist that stretched in all directions. The air felt cold and damp, carrying a faint metallic tang that reminded me of blood. I stood frozen in the doorway, the threshold between the impossibility in front of me and the too long hallway behind. That's when I heard the sound. A faint clicking, like fingernails tapping on glass. It came from deep within the mist, soft at first but growing louder, closer. I slammed the door shut and stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. The hallway was different now. The lights were dimmer, their buzz quieter, almost as if the building itself were holding its breath. The air felt heavier, the walls closer, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I turned and ran. I don't know how long I ran, but the hallway didn't end. It didn't even change. No matter how far I went, the doors stayed the same, evenly spaced, their brass numbers glinting faintly in the flickering light. My breath came in short, panicked gasps, my legs aching with the effort. Eventually, I stopped. I leaned against the wall, trying to steady myself, when I noticed one of the doors ajar. It wasn't much, just a crack wide enough to see a sliver of darkness beyond, but it felt deliberate, like an invitation, or a trap. Against every instinct screaming at me to walk away, I approached. I pushed the door open, slowly, my hand trembling on the handle. Inside was my apartment. The furniture was exactly where I'd left it. The faint smell of coffee still lingered in the air, and the book I'd been reading sat open on the couch. Relief flooded through me, and I stepped inside, closing the door behind me. But something was wrong. It took me a moment to realize what it was. The windows. They showed nothing. No streetlights, no buildings, no sky. Just an impenetrable blackness, as if the apartment had been dropped into a void. I approached the nearest window, pressing my hand against the glass. It was cold, unnaturally so, and the blackness seemed to ripple faintly under my touch, like water disturbed by a stone. A noise behind me made me spin around. Someone was sitting on the couch. It was me. Not a reflection, not a twin, me. Same clothes, same tired expression, same faint scar on my left eyebrow from a childhood fall. They were holding the book, flipping through its pages idly, as if waiting for me to say something. "Who are you?" I whispered. They looked up, their expression calm but unreadable. "You shouldn't have kept walking." My mouth went dry. "You're not supposed to be here," they continued, their voice eerily steady. "But since you are, you'll need to stay." I backed away, my hands searching for the doorknob. The other me tilted their head, watching with faint amusement. "You can try," they said, "but the hallway doesn't let you leave." I didn't wait to hear more. I wrenched the door open and bolted back into the hallway, my heart pounding so loudly it drowned out everything else. The doors were different now. Some hung open, revealing glimpses of impossible things. A vast, starless sky, a field of pale, featureless mannequins, a staircase spiraling upward into infinity. Others pulsed faintly, as if something on the other side were pressing against them, waiting to be let through. I kept running, refusing to stop, refusing to look back. Eventually, I reached a door that looked normal. Just an ordinary apartment door, its brass number gleaming softly. It was mine. I didn't hesitate. I flung it open and stumbled inside, slamming it shut behind me. The room was empty. No furniture, no books, no signs of life. Just 4 bare walls and a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling, swaying faintly as though disturbed by an unseen breeze. The doorknob turned behind me. I didn't wait to see who or what was coming through. I ran to the far corner of the room, pressing myself against the wall, my breath shallow and frantic. The door opened, but no one entered. The hallway stretched beyond it, longer than ever, twisting in impossible directions, its fluorescent lights buzzing faintly in the distance. "I think I'm still running." The bracelet wasn't hers. It was too delicate, a fine chain of rose gold with tiny charms shaped like stars and moons, each one catching the light in a way that seemed almost deliberate. It had appeared on the bathroom sink one morning, coiled neatly beside the soap dispenser. She noticed it as she reached for the hand towel, its presence both unassuming and deeply wrong. Her jewelry was simpler, silver, understated, and practical. She hadn't bought anything new in years, and this bracelet didn't belong to the collection she had neatly arranged in her bedside drawer. "Did you leave something in the bathroom?" she asked casually when he came into the kitchen, still rubbing his damp hair with a towel. He glanced at her, then at the bracelet she held up. "Oh, that. No idea where it came from. Maybe the cleaner left it?" "We don't have a cleaner." His laugh was quick, a little too quick. "You know what I mean. It could have been stuck in one of the boxes from when we moved. That would have been plausible, if they hadn't moved 3 years ago." She nodded and slipped the bracelet into her pocket, but the smooth weight of it sat with her all day, pressing questions she wasn't ready to ask. A week later, she found the lipstick. It was a shade she would never wear, deep crimson, bold and dramatic. It rolled out from under the couch when she was vacuuming, the kind of small detail that could easily have been overlooked in a busier life. She held it up to the light, inspecting the faint smear across the rim, and felt something twist in her stomach. That night, she placed it on the coffee table while they watched a movie. He glanced at it during the opening credits, his expression carefully neutral. "What's this?" he asked, as though the answer wasn't already etched into the silence between them. "Found it under the couch." "Huh." He picked it up, turning it over in his fingers like a detective examining a piece of evidence. "Probably the neighbor's kid. Remember when they came over to borrow the ladder? Maybe it fell out of her bag." It was a good excuse. Too good. She wanted to challenge it, but instead she nodded and watched him put the lipstick in a drawer she knew she'd never see again. The unease grew like a second heartbeat, pulsing faintly behind her every thought. He hadn't changed in obvious ways. He still cooked on Sunday nights, still hummed under his breath when he read the news. But there was a shift, a current beneath the surface, pulling him towards something she couldn't see. One afternoon, while he was out, she went to his desk. It wasn't snooping, she told herself, just curiosity. His laptop was locked, as always, but the desk drawer slid open easily. Inside, she found a key. It was small and silver, attached to a plain black fob with no markings. She turned it over in her hand, frowning. It wasn't for the house. She knew every lock they owned, and it wasn't for his car. She placed it back in the drawer, careful to leave everything exactly as she'd found it, and went to make tea. That evening, she asked him if he'd be home late. He blinked, caught off guard. "Why would I be?" "No reason," she said. "Just wondering." The next day, she followed him. It wasn't something she'd ever imagined herself doing, but as she sat in her car, parked across the street from his office, watching him walk out with a small bag slung over his shoulder, she felt a strange calm. This was the only way to quiet the questions. He didn't go far, just a few blocks down to a storage facility, one of those sprawling complexes with numbered doors and endless rows. She watched as he unlocked a unit near the back and disappeared inside. She waited for nearly an hour before he emerged, his bag now noticeably heavier. That night, over dinner, she asked if he'd been anywhere interesting. He shook his head. "Just work. Boring stuff." "You?" "Same," she said, her smile tight. The next morning, she called in sick. She drove to the storage facility with the key in her pocket, her heart pounding harder with every step. The unit was easy to find, the lock sliding open with a satisfying click. Inside was a life she didn't recognize. The walls were lined with shelves, each one crammed with objects she couldn't place. Books with strange inscriptions, photographs of people she'd never seen, and a collection of vintage postcards, each one addressed to him in looping, unfamiliar handwriting. At the center of the unit stood a mannequin, dressed in a red silk dress that shimmered faintly in the dim light. Around its wrist was the bracelet, its charms catching the light as though mocking her. She stepped closer, her hand trembling as she reached for the postcards. One of them was dated 2 weeks ago, with a simple message scrawled across the back, "Thank you for the time. Same place next month?" She left everything exactly as it was, locked the unit, and drove home in silence. That evening, when he asked if she wanted to order takeout, she nodded. "Sure," she said, her voice steady, and as they ate, laughing about a sitcom rerun, she felt the calm return. This wasn't a confrontation she needed to have. Not yet. She would wait, watching the threads pull tighter, until he unraveled on his own. I never wanted to work the night shift. It was supposed to be temporary, just a stopgap until I found something better. The gas station sat on the edge of a forgotten highway, surrounded by fields that stretched into endless darkness. No houses, no towns, just miles of cracked asphalt and whispering wind. The owner, Frank, was a grizzled old guy who barely spoke, except to remind me of 2 rules. 1. Don't go outside after midnight. 2. Never, under any circumstances, look directly at the security monitor labeled CM6. I thought he was messing with me at first. The station wasn't exactly the kind of place that needed rules. We sold stale snacks, overpriced cigarettes, and coffee that tasted like burnt rubber. The only customers were truckers or the occasional drifter passing through. For the first few weeks, nothing happened. Midnight would come and go, and I'd sit behind the counter, scrolling on my phone or flipping through old magazines. Cam 6, mounted above the back door, always showed the same thing. A narrow alley lined with dumpsters and a single flickering light. Then, one night, I made the mistake of looking too long. I'd been zoning out, staring at the wall of monitors, when something on CM6 caught my attention. At first, I thought it was just a shadow shifting beneath the light. But then it moved, slowly, unnaturally, like it was testing the limits of its shape. I leaned closer, squinting at the screen. It wasn't a shadow. It was tall and gaunt, its limbs too long, its head tilted at an impossible angle. The flickering light cast faint highlights on its form, revealing a texture that made my stomach turn. Skin that wasn't skin, rippling and shifting like oil on water. The thing seemed to notice me. It didn't have eyes, not in any way I could recognize, but I felt its focus, sharp and unrelenting. My hand trembled as I reached for the monitor's power switch, but before I could touch it, the screen went black. The lights in the station flickered. For a moment, everything was silent. Then came the tapping. It was faint at first, like fingernails drumming against glass. I turned slowly, my breath catching in my throat. The tapping was coming from the front window. There was nothing there, just the reflection of the station's fluorescent lights and the faint outline of the pumps outside. I told myself it was the wind, that it was nothing. But then the tapping came again, louder, more deliberate. It wasn't random, it was a pattern. 3 taps, a pause, then 2 more. I backed away, my heart racing. "Frank?" I called, my voice cracking. No answer. The tapping stopped. For a few minutes, everything was still. I thought maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe I was just tired, my mind playing tricks on me. But then the sound shifted. It was coming from the back door. The alley. I didn't want to check. I wanted to lock myself in the bathroom and wait for morning. But something drew me toward the noise, like a string pulling me closer. The back door had a small window, and as I approached, I saw it. Just a glimpse, but enough to freeze me in place. The thing from CM6 was standing there, pressed against the glass. Its face, or what I thought was its face, was smooth and featureless, but something beneath the surface writhed, pushing and pulling as though trying to escape. It raised a hand, long, skeletal fingers tapping the same rhythm on the glass. 3 taps, a pause, 2 more. I stumbled back, my legs weak beneath me. "Go away," I shouted, though my voice barely sounded like my own. It didn't move. The lights flickered again, and when they came back on, the thing was gone. I didn't sleep that day. When Frank showed up for his shift, I tried to explain what I'd seen, but he just stared at me with that same blank expression. "You looked at CM6, didn't you?" he asked, lighting a cigarette. I nodded, too shaken to lie. Frank sighed, taking a long drag. "That's why I told you not to. Once it knows you're watching, it doesn't leave." "What the hell is it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Frank didn't answer. He just handed me a piece of paper with 2 words scrawled in messy handwriting. Don't follow. That night, I almost quit. I drove halfway home, the highway stretching out endlessly in the dark, but something kept pulling me back. The station felt like it was waiting for me, and I hated that I couldn't explain why. When I finally walked through the door, I checked the monitors out of habit. Cam 6 was still off, but this time, there was something new on CM2, which showed the front lot. A figure was standing by the pumps, tall and thin. Its face turned toward the camera. My phone buzzed in my pocket. The text was from an unknown number. 3 taps. Pause. 2 more. I didn't finish the shift. I left the station keys on the counter and drove, faster than I ever have, until the place was just a distant memory in my rearview mirror. But I know it's not over. Last night, I woke to a faint tapping on my bedroom window. 3 taps. A pause. 2 more. The house on Ashgrove Road had been empty for years, its paint faded and its windows clouded with grime. I walked past it every day on my way to work, barely glancing at it. Just another forgotten place in a town full of them. But one morning, something was different. The "for sale" sign that had been leaning drunkenly against the fence for as long as I could remember was gone. In its place was a single piece of paper taped to the front gate. The wind tugged at it, but it held firm, fluttering like a beckoning hand. Curiosity made me cross the street, though I told myself it was nothing. Trash, maybe. A notice from the city. But when I got close enough to read the paper, the words were written clearly in block letters. Enter to claim what you've lost. The sentence struck me like a physical blow, though I couldn't explain why. I hadn't lost anything, or at least, nothing tangible. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the house. The front door was ajar, a sliver of darkness visible beyond it. The whole scene felt staged, like a trap too obvious to be taken seriously. I should have walked away. Instead, I pushed the gate open. The yard was overgrown, weeds climbing the rusted fence and spilling across the cracked walkway. The air smelled faintly of damp earth and mildew, the kind of smell that sticks to your skin long after you've left it behind. I stepped through the door, and the world seemed to exhale around me. The house was quiet, but not in the way of an empty building. It was the quiet of something holding its breath, waiting. The hallway stretched ahead of me, lined with peeling wallpaper and warped floorboards. Dust hung in the air, glowing faintly in the weak light filtering through the stained glass above the door. At the end of the hallway was another piece of paper, pinned to the wall with a rusted nail. 1 room for each memory. My stomach turned, though I didn't know why. The words felt personal, invasive, like someone had reached into my head and written them just for me. There were doors on either side of the hallway, each one slightly ajar. The first door on my right opened into a kitchen. The smell hit me before I stepped inside, familiar and strange at the same time. It was the scent of my grandmother's house, a mixture of fresh-baked bread and lavender. The room was perfectly preserved, down to the lace curtains I hadn't seen since I was a child. The table was set for 2, the teapot steaming gently as though someone had just poured it. I backed out of the room, heart pounding. The second door led to a bedroom. My bedroom, from when I was 12. The bed was unmade, clothes scattered across the floor, posters of bands I hadn't thought about in years covering the walls. The sight of it made my chest tighten, a wave of nostalgia and something darker washing over me. I stepped closer, my eyes catching on the desk in the corner. My old journal sat there, the leather cover cracked and faded. I hadn't seen it in years. I thought I'd thrown it away. Flipping it open, I found the pages blank, except for 1 line written in the center of the first page. Do you remember what you left behind? I closed the journal, my hands trembling. The farther I went into the house, the more the room seemed to pull pieces of me from the past. There was the living room where my parents used to argue late into the night, their voices low but cutting. There was the basement where my brother and I had once hidden during a storm, telling ghost stories to drown out the sound of the wind. Every room was familiar, but wrong. The edges of the memories felt sharper here, the details more vivid than they had any right to be. At the end of the hallway was a staircase leading up to the 2nd floor. The steps groaned under my weight, the sound echoing through the house. The upstairs hallway was shorter, with only 1 door at the end. This door was different from the others, Heavier, the wood darker and polished to a shine. A piece of paper was taped to it, the handwriting larger and more frantic than before. "What you seek is inside." My pulse quickened as I reached for the doorknob. The metal was warm under my hand, almost pulsing like a heartbeat. The room beyond was empty, except for a mirror standing in the center. It wasn't an ordinary mirror. The glass was dark, almost black, and its surface shimmered faintly as though it were holding back something alive. I stepped closer, my reflection coming into view, but it wasn't quite right. The person in the mirror looked like me, but their eyes were too wide, their expression too calm. They raised their hand, and I did the same, though it didn't feel like I was in control. The mirror rippled, and the reflection stepped forward. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat as the figure emerged from the glass. They were me, but not. Their features were sharper, their movements smoother, as though they were more real than I was. "You've forgotten," they said, their voice low and steady. "Forgotten what?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. "What you left behind," they replied. "What you abandoned to become who you are now." I shook my head. "I don't understand." They smiled, the expression sharp and cold. "You will." The room dissolved around us, the walls and floor fading into a swirling void. Images flashed before me, moments from my life, fractured and out of order. My first heartbreak, the day my brother moved away, the night I stood in the rain, clutching a letter I never sent. The figure stepped closer, their presence overwhelming. "Do you want to take it back?" I hesitated, the weight of the question pressing down on me. "What happens if I do?" They didn't answer. Instead, they raised a hand and pressed it to my chest. The world tilted, and I was falling, the images spinning faster and faster until they blurred into darkness. When I woke, I was back in my apartment. The house on Ashgrove Road was gone. I've searched for it, but there's no record of it ever existing. The lot where it stood is empty now, overgrown with weeds. But every so often, I find pieces of it. A note tucked into my jacket pocket, a key that doesn't fit any lock I own. And in the mirror, just for a moment, I see them, watching, waiting, and I know they'll come back for me.